Hello, and welcome to Entangled, the podcast where we explore the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being having a human experience. I'm your host, Jordan Euclid, and this is part 5 of the miniseries on the real Robert F. Kennedy. In this series, we ask, which politician is the Robert F. Kennedy of this generation? In parts 1 through 4, we compared RFK's policies to those of our modern politicians, including Joe Biden Jr., Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., focusing on Bobby's policies towards ending the war in Vietnam, fighting corruption and organized crime, and civil rights. As we asked, which politician today does embody the RFK of this generation? In part 5, we explore the assassinations of the 1960s. We start by asking who assassinated John F. Kennedy. We then ask who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy. From there, we explore who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr., and we conclude with an exploration of who assassinated Malcolm X. Outros are available for this and all episodes at entangledpodcast.substack.com. Music from the show is available on the Spotify playlist Entangled the Vibes. If you like the show, please drop a 5-star review and subscribe on Substack, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please enjoy the episode. Who assassinated John F. Kennedy? It's time to address the $64,000 question, who killed President John F. Kennedy? The laws of physics and the logic of common sense tell us there's no way Lee Harvey Oswald could have been the lone shooter. In fact, there's strong evidence to suggest that he wasn't even on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building when the assassination took place. Further, it's quite possible that Lee Harvey Oswald is in fact an amalgamation of two men, Harvey Oswald, the patsy who took the blame, and Lee Oswald, a CIA asset. Remember what Mr. X said in Oliver Stone's film JFK? The how and the who is just scenery for the public. Oswald, Ruby, Cuba, the Mafia. It keeps them guessing, like some kind of parlor game. Prevents them from asking the most important question. Why? Why was Kennedy killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who? This 1991 film was adapted from the book On the Trail of the Assassins by New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison, the only prosecutor to prosecute conspiracy charges in the assassination of JFK. In the film, Stone portrays Garrison's role in indicting businessman Clay Shaw for conspiracy to kill JFK and expands on alternative theories versus those provided by the Warren Commission. The film caused an uproar with the public, led to the creation of the 1992 Assassinations Record Review Board, AARRB, and a renaissance in JFK research that has lasted to the present day. American hero Jim Garrison attempted to answer Mr. X's question as to why Kennedy was killed and who has the power to cover it up. In a 1967 interview with Playboy magazine, he stated the following: Playboy, accepting for a moment your contention that there was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy, have you been able to discover who was involved, in addition to David Ferrie, how it was done, and why? Garrison, yes, I have. President Kennedy was killed for one reason, because he was working for a reconciliation with the USSR and Castro's Cuba. His assassins were a group of fanatic anti-communists with a fusion of interest in preventing Kennedy from achieving peaceful relations with the communist world. On the operative level of the conspiracy, you find anti-Castro Cuban exiles who never forgave Kennedy for failing to send in U.S. air cover at the Bay of Pigs, and who feared that the thaw following the missile crisis in October 1962 augured the total frustration of their plans to liberate Cuba. They believed sincerely that Kennedy had sold them out to the communists. On a higher control level, you find a number of people of ultra-right-wing persuasion. Not simply conservatives, mind you, but people who could be described as neo-Nazi, including a small clique that had defected from the Minutemen because it considered the group too liberal. These elements had their canteens ready and their guns loaded. They lacked only a target. After Kennedy's domestic moves towards racial integration and his attempts to forge a peaceful foreign policy, as exemplified by his signing of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, they found that target. So both of these groups had a vital stake in changing U.S. foreign policy, ideological on the part of the paramilitary rightists, and both ideological and personal with the anti-Castro exiles, many of whom felt they would never see their homes again if Kennedy's policy of détente was allowed to succeed. The CIA was involved with both of these groups. In the New Orleans area, where the conspiracy was hatched, the CIA was training a mixed bag of Minutemen, Cuban exiles, and other anti-Castro adventurers north of Lake Pontchartrain for a foray into Cuba and assassination attempt on Fidel Castro. David Ferry, who operated on the command level of the ultra-rightists, was deeply involved in this effort. The CIA itself apparently did not take the détente too seriously until the late summer of 1963 because it maintained its financing and training of anti-Castro adventurers. There was, in fact, a triangulation of CIA-supported anti-Castro activity between Dallas, where Jack Ruby was involved in collecting guns and ammunition for the underground, and Miami and New Orleans, where most of the training was going on. But then, Kennedy, who had signed a secret agreement with Khrushchev after the missile crisis pledging not to invade Cuba if Russia would soft-pedal Castro's subversive activities in the Americas, began to crack down on CIA operations against Cuba. As a result, on July 31, 1963, the FBI raided the headquarters of the group of Cuban exiles and Minutemen training north of Lake Pontchartrain and confiscated all their guns and ammunition, despite the fact that the operation had the sanction of the CIA. This action may have sealed Kennedy's fate. By the early fall of 1963, Kennedy's plan for a détente with Cuba was in high gear. Ambassador William Atwood, a close personal friend of the late president, recounts that a thaw in the U.S.-Cuban relations was definitely in the works at this time, and the president, more than the State Department, was interested in exploring the Cuban overture. One of the intermediaries between Castro and Kennedy was the late television commentator Lisa Howard, who met secretly with Ernesto Che Guevara to prepare peace terms between the U.S. and Castro. Ms. Howard was arranging a conference between Bobby Kennedy and Guevara when the president was shot in Dallas. In a United Nations speech on October 7, 1963, Adlai Stevenson set forth the possibility of a termination of hostilities between the two countries, and on November 19th, presidential aide McGeorge Bundy, who was acting as an intermediary in the secret discussions, told Ambassador Atwood that the president wanted to discuss his plans for a Cuban-American détente in depth with him right after a brief trip to Dallas. The rest is history. One of the two heads of state involved in negotiating that détente is now dead, but the survivor, Fidel Castro, said on November 23rd that the assassination was the work of elements in the U.S. opposed to peace. And the Cuban Foreign Ministry official charged that the Kennedy assassination was a provocation against world peace perfectly and minutely prepared for the most reactionary sectors of the United States. Most Americans at the time, myself included, thought this was just communist propaganda. But Castro knew what he was talking about. A few weeks after the assassination, the Cuban ambassador to the UN, Dr. Carlos Lechuga, was instructed by Castro to begin formal discussions in the hope that Kennedy's peace plan would be carried on by his successor. Ambassador Atwood writes that, "I informed Bundy and later was told that the Cuban exercise would be put on ice for a while, which it was and where it has been ever since." The assassins had achieved their aim. Playboy. This is interesting speculation, but isn't that all it is? Speculation? Garrison. No, because we know enough about the key individuals involved in the conspiracy, Latins and Americans alike, to know that this was their motive for the murder of John Kennedy. First of all, you have to understand the mentality of these people. Take the Cuban exiles involved. Here are men, some of whom survived the Bay of Pigs, who for years had been whipped up by the CIA into a frenzy of anti-Castro hatred, and who had been solemnly assured by American intelligence agencies that they were going to liberate their homeland with American support. They had one disappointment after another. The Bay of Pigs debacle, the failure to invade Cuba during the missile crisis, the effective crushing of their underground in Cuba by Castro's secret police. But they kept on hoping, and the CIA kept fanning their hopes. Then they listened to Kennedy's famous speech at American University on June 10, 1963, where he really kicked off the new drive for a détente, and they heard the president of the country in which they'd placed all their hope saying we must make peace with the communists since we both breathe the same air. Well, this worries them, but the CIA continues financing and training their underground cadres, so there's still hope. And then suddenly, in the late summer of 1963, the CIA is forced by presidential pressure to withdraw all funds and assistance from the Cuban exiles. Think of the impact of this, particularly on the group here in New Orleans, which had been trained for months to make an assassination attempt on Castro, and then found itself coolly jettisoned by its benefactors in Washington. These adventurers were worked up to a fever pitch, and when the CIA withdrew its support and they couldn't fight Castro, they picked their next victim, John F. Kennedy. That, in a nutshell, is the genesis of the assassination. President Kennedy died because he wanted peace. End quote. Nearly 60 years after this interview, The public has benefited from additional books, investigations, and declassified documents to build on Garrison's discoveries. Concurrently, dedicated journalists and whistleblowers have come forth to expose the true nature of the organized crime syndicate that killed JFK, the deep state cabal responsible for his murder. As I reflect on Jim Garrison's commentary, I agree with his assessment that JFK was the greatest threat the military-industrial complex had ever seen, and his resistance to the CIA's subversion of the constitutional republic of the United States is likely what sealed his fate. I would, however, refine Garrison's description of the paramilitary rightists at the top of this cabal as anti-communists. While men like Allen Dulles, J. Edgar Hoover, and George H.W. Bush have used the threat of communism to split the world into a Hegelian dialectic between capitalism versus communism, these men have no loyalty to the principles of free market economy. On the contrary, they have been actively working to destroy capitalism and to steal all the world's wealth for themselves and their one world government. As such, for reasons which will become clear shortly, the leaders of this cabal can be more accurately described as Marxists and Luciferians. President Kennedy's attacks on the CIA specifically and the military-industrial complex broadly led to his assassination, as we can recognize with President Johnson's immediate reversal of course on Vietnam, Cuba, and the CIA after JFK's murder. However, we should recognize that this was not the only center of deep state power which JFK threatened. At the time of JFK's assassination, Israel had been actively pursuing the development of nuclear weapons. Kennedy had been fighting against their nuclear weapons program, which he felt would permanently destabilize the Middle East, and ran directly contrary to his efforts towards nuclear nonproliferation. Israel developed the bomb a year or two after Kennedy's assassination. The tension around the State of Israel has been used as a constant source of division between Jews, Christians, and Muslims ever since. JFK went further after the Rothschild-controlled Zionist State of Israel and was forcing the American Zionist Council to register as a foreign agent, blocking them from donating to U.S. officials. AIPAC replaced the American Zionist Council without any opposition, and today is not registered as a foreign agent. Thomas Massie, one of the few remaining loyal members of the U.S. Congress, recently highlighted the threat of Israeli influence on American politics when he stated that every member of Congress has a designated AIPAC person within his or her district.
Everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What's that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has someone like this?
That's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to D.C., you go have lunch with them. And they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them.
That's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. And it's literally what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get him to dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that.
JFK recognized that the American government should be a government of, by, and for the American people. Free from the influence of foreign governments, Israeli, Saudi, British, Chinese, Russian, Iranian, or any other. And free from the subversion of secret police, be they CIA, FBI, Mossad, MI6, KGB, MSS, or any other. JFK also attacked the keystone of the cabal's stranglehold of power, their control of the money supply. Specifically, he went after the Rothschild-controlled central bank known as the Federal Reserve System. 5 months before his assassination, JFK issued Executive Order 11110, which granted the Treasury the authority to issue silver coins. By creating money tied to hard assets abundant in the United States, JFK was working to destroy the monopoly held by the Federal Reserve. After JFK's assassination, the government stopped issuing these silver coins. It's almost enough to make you ask, were there any parallels between the assassinations of JFK and President Abraham Lincoln? Was Lincoln's assassination related to his issuance of greenbacks during and after the Civil War? In 1864, President Lincoln wrote, quote, "The money powers prey upon the nation in times of peace and conspire against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of this country will endeavor and prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated into a few hands and the republic is destroyed." End quote. You know, Mr. Lincoln may have been onto something there.
Additionally, it's worth considering that in his efforts to dismantle the military-industrial complex, President Kennedy intended to disclose the truth about the UFO phenomenon. Namely, that there are extraterrestrial craft that have been shot down and recovered by a criminal, transnational organization operating from inside of unacknowledged special access programs, and that these technologies have been reverse engineered and used for all kinds of criminality, including the trafficking of weapons, drugs, and humans. Dr. Stephen Greer, whose work I've shared on past episodes, has been leading the UFO and ET disclosure efforts for the past 30 years. He writes in his book, Unacknowledged, quote, "John F. Kennedy had a lot on his plate during his abbreviated term as president. He had the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he knew the U.S. intelligence organizations needed to be reined in, including the Black Ops group controlling the UFO and ET issues. Jack Kennedy intended to shrink the military-industrial complex, end the Cold War, and make peace with the Soviet Union. He wanted to pull out of Vietnam and had plans to virtually dissolve the CIA, who were involved in some nefarious plots, including the sale of narcotics. And yes, JFK also wanted the UFO matter disclosed. The fascist empire lurking in America's shadows was not about to allow that to happen. Their first target, however, would be the president's mistress. Through my work, I've established some deep contacts within the intelligence and national security communities. A few senior NSA people have given me documents over the years for safekeeping. One of these includes an oversized Xerox copy of a 1962 wiretap transcription which bears the code names Project Moondust and Project 46. The original, which is classified top secret, has not been declassified. It was given to me so I could get it to the right people. This document was a wiretap transcription summary of Marilyn Monroe, who had recently been jilted by the Kennedy brothers and was upset and hurt, called Robert Kennedy and a socialite in New York, an art dealer friend of hers, stating that she was going to set up a press conference and tell the public what Jack Kennedy had told her regarding objects from outer space that had crashed and been retrieved in New Mexico in the 1940s. President Kennedy had obviously confided this information to her, having seen the ET craft and debris from the UFO crash. After receiving the document, I located someone who was with the Los Angeles Police Department Intelligence Unit that helped facilitate the wiretapping and monitoring up to the time of Marilyn Monroe's death and knew how the actress was really killed. There is no doubt that she was murdered by cutout agents of the U.S. intelligence community. As you can see, the original document was signed by James Angleton, the legendary fanatical mole hunter and leak stopper within the CIA. I've had this document authenticated by the top document authenticator in the world. There is no doubt it is the real deal. In my opinion, this transcription of the Marilyn Monroe wiretap served as the actress's death warrant, for it summarized her immediate intention to disclose confidential information regarding the Roswell crash. Perhaps she felt that the subject was benign enough to announce to the world, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned," without getting the president in trouble. Perhaps at that juncture, she didn't care. 36 hours later, she was found dead of a drug overdose. When I shared this information with my friend Burl Ives, the Academy Award-winning actor, he was not surprised. Quote, "Marilyn Monroe and I knew each other very well, and I can tell you this. All of us today who knew her knew that she had been murdered, but it wasn't until today that I finally knew why." End quote.
Finally, I'll mention that the more one explores the JFK assassination, the more questions we uncover about what really happened that day. For example, how do we explain Jackie Kennedy's actions in the limousine immediately following JFK's assassination? And what is a SWIP? There was a conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy. Allen Dulles is obviously the most likely suspect to have coordinated the execution and cover-up. Dulles is the man who was fired as CIA director after lying to JFK about the Bay of Pigs invasion, a disastrous escapade. Dulles had incorrectly assumed he could force Kennedy's hand into deploying troops into Cuba. Even though Dulles was no longer running the CIA the day Kennedy was killed, we should not be fooled into thinking the agency was the true seat of this man's power. The American public and humanity broadly deserves to know the truth about who killed President John F. Kennedy and why. My research into JFK's assassination is built on a wide variety of sources. The most substantive information draws from Daniel Sheehan's 2016 UC Santa Cruz course, Rulers of the Realm, Oliver Stone's documentaries JFK Revisited and JFK Destiny Betrayed, and The Assassinations, Probe magazine on JFK, MLK, RFK, and Malcolm X, edited by James D. Eugenio and Lisa Pease. If I were to organize a new investigation into his murder, the following organizations and individuals would be included on the subpoena list. I'll expand on a few subsets of these individuals shortly. Subsequent U.S. presidents: Lyndon B. Johnson, 36th President of the United States. Richard Nixon, 37th President of the United States. Gerald Ford, 38th President of the United States.
George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States.
JFK and LBJ administration officials. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI Director. Clyde Tolson, Assistant Director of the FBI. Nicholas Katzenbach, Acting Attorney General. General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force and Presiding Officer of JFK's military autopsy. Colonel George Dorman, Aide to Curtis LeMay. General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
General Lyman Lemitzer, NATO Supreme Allied Commander of Europe.
Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor. Bill Moyers, aide to LBJ and future correspondent at CBS, NBC, and PBS.
Clifton Carter, advisor to LBJ and former executive director of the DNC.
And Walter Jenkins, aide to LBJ. CIA executives: Richard Nixon, former vice president and head of CIA Operation 40 and the S-Force Assassination Squad. Alan Dulles, former CIA director. James Jesus Angleton, CIA counterintelligence chief and CIA liaison to the FBI and Israeli intelligence Mossad. Richard Helms, CIA director of plans or covert operations, and the CIA liaison to the Warren Commission and future CIA director. Theodore G. Shackley, CIA Miami station chief. Edward G. Lansdale, CIA Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, and Sheffield Edwards, CIA Chief of Security. Warren Commission members, defenders of the Warren Report. Alan Dulles, the former CIA director. Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John J. McCloy, Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. And Gerald Ford, Republican representative from Michigan and future unelected President of the United States. Warren Commission members, detractors from the Warren Report. Dick Russell Jr., Democratic representative from Louisiana. Hale Boggs, Democratic senator from Georgia. And John Sherman Cooper, Republican senator from Kentucky. The CIA S-Force, the likely assassins: Felix Rodriguez, a.k.a. Max Gomez. David Morales, and Rafael Chichi Quintero. The CIA S-Force other members: William Rip Robertson, one of the two CIA officers commanding the Bay of Pigs invasion. Grayston Lynch, the other CIA officer commanding the Bay of Pigs. E. Howard Hunt, the CIA Covert Actions Officer. Frank Sturgis, another CIA undercover operative. Felipe Vidal Jorge, Raul Villavende, Rene Corvo, Francisco Paco Chavez, Ricardo Chavez, Luis Posada Carrillas, Joaquin San Genis, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, and Bernard Barker. Warren Commission operatives: Arlen Specter, assistant counsel and author of The Magic Bullet Theory and future senator from Pennsylvania. Eugene Rostow, dean of Yale Law School and future undersecretary of state for political affairs. Dean Acheson, former secretary of state. Joseph Alsop, columnist for The Washington Post and the New York Herald Tribune. David Bellin, staff counsel to the Warren Commission and future executive director of the Rockefeller Commission. Daryl Tomlinson and Opie Wright, Parkland Hospital employees who discovered the magic bullet. Commanders James Humes and Thornton Boswell, military doctors who performed the autopsy. Pierre Fink, ballistics wound expert at the autopsy. Admiral George Berkeley, JFK's personal doctor and the only doctor present at both Parkland Hospital, Texas after the shooting, and Bethesda, Maryland for the autopsy. Robert Knudsen, White House photographer suspected of taking photos during the alleged second autopsy. Melvin Belly, the defense attorney for Jack Ruby. And J.D. Tippit, the Dallas police officer and alleged second victim of Lee Harvey Oswald on November 22, 1963. Tippit's physical appearance earned him the nickname of his doppelganger, JFK. What is a squib? CIA and FBA operatives/assets. Richard Bissell, former CIA director of plans, fired by JFK after the Bay of Pigs. Robert Mayhew, the CIA liaison to the Mafia. David Atlee Phillips, CIA head of Cuban propaganda. Thomas Karamessinis, the CIA deputy director for plans. J.C. King, the CIA chief of the Western Hemisphere. William Sullivan, the head of the FBI's Domestic Intelligence Division. Lee Harvey Oswald, likely amalgamation of Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald. CIA operative and agent provocateur, patsy blamed for JFK's assassination. Marguerite Oswald, mother of Lee Oswald and suspected CIA asset. Lieutenant General Leslie Richard Groves, Jr., former director of the Manhattan Project, the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, and vice president of Remington Rand's Research and Development. Bill Harvey, CIA counterintelligence chief in charge of Staff D and former FBI agent. Des Fitzgerald, CIA officer involved in Cuban operations and the future deputy director of plans. John McCone, CIA director at the time of JFK's assassination. William Colby, future CIA director. Birch O'Neill, head of CIA Counterintelligence, or CI, and Special Investigations Group, or SIG. Other members of CIA CI SIG include Raymond G. Roca, Ann Egerter, Newton Scooty Miller, Stefan Roll, Tracy Barnes, Pete Bagley, and Donovan Pratt. George de Mornsfield, CIA field operative. Guy Bannister, FBI agent in New Orleans. Gerald Tuhagwe, FBI asset and vice president of the CIA FBI affiliated Friends of Democratic Cuba. Clay Shaw, aka Clay or Clem Bertrand, CIA informant. David Ferry, CIA operative and pilot. Died mysteriously in 1967, less than 1 week after news broke about DA Jim Garrison's investigation into Clay Shaw. Bernardo de Torres, CIA operative who infiltrated Garrison's investigation. He disappeared after the mysterious death of Ferry. Gordon Novell, CIA operative. William Martin, CIA operative. Carlos Quiroga, CIA operative. Hal Hendricks, CIA operative. Cord Meyer, CIA operative. Sergio Aracha Smith, head of CIA-backed Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front in New Orleans. Emilio Santana, CIA operative for the Directorate of Plans. Win Scott, CIA Mexico City Station. Ann Goodpasture, CIA Mexico City Station. John Whitten, CIA Western Hemisphere, Division 3. Elsie Scaletti, CIA Mexico City Station. Michael and Ruth Payne, neighbors of Oswald. Police search of their home revealed a Minox camera of Oswald's that later disappeared from the FBI's inventory list. Sidney Gottlieb, head of CIA MK Ultra, Black Sorcerer. Louis Jolly West, CIA MK Ultra, psychologist and hypnotist, Scarecrow. Dr. Frank Silva, suspected MK Ultra researcher at Tulane University and known associate of Oswald. Alton Oshner Sr., surgeon and medical researcher at Tulane University. George Joanidas, CIA chief of psychological warfare. Eugene Hale Brading, also known as James Lee, and Jim Braden, arrested for questioning after both JFK and RFK's assassinations. Robert Frazier, FBI lab investigator. Elmer Lee Todd, FBI agent. Marvin Giesling, FBI agent. Marion Baker, Dallas Police Department officer. Roy Truly, Oswald's boss at the book depository. Dean Andrews, attorney asked to represent Lee Harvey Oswald between JFK's and Oswald's assassinations. Bill Alexander, Dallas Deputy District Attorney. G. Robert Blakey, the second chief counsel of the House Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, of the 1970s. Donald Rumsfeld, Congressman, Republican from Illinois, and future Secretary of Defense under Presidents Gerald Ford and George W. Bush. Judith Campbell Exner, alleged mistress of JFK. And Mary Pinchot Meyer, alleged mistress of JFK and wife of CIA officer / Alan Dulles protege Cord Meyer. Secret Service executives and operatives. James Rowley, Secret Service chief. Thomas J. Kelly, Secret Service Inspector General and Warren Commission liaison. William Greer, Secret Service agent and driver of JFK's limousine, alleged by investigative journalist Bill Cooper to have delivered the fatal shot to President Kennedy. Richard Johnson, Secret Service agent, and Elmer Moore, Secret Service agent. Authors and members of the press. Members of the press suspected to have served as disinformation agents on behalf of intelligence include Dan Rather, CBS anchorman. Walter Cronkite, CBS anchorman. Richard Salon, president of CBS News. Jack Valenti, head of the Motion Picture Association and liaison to the news media on the Kennedy assassination, future press secretary for President Ford. Walter Sheridan, NBC News special correspondent who produced an hour-long special critical of DA Jim Garrison's investigation. Prior to NBC, Sheridan worked for the Office of Naval Intelligence and NSA Counterintelligence. C.D. Jackson, senior executive of Time Life and former OSS operative who purchased the Zapruder film, locking it away from the public for years until its release during Jim Garrison's investigation. Richard Billings, editor of Life magazine. Priscilla Johnson McMillan, author of Marina and Lee. Ron Kessler, New York Times and Washington Post journalist, author of Sins of the Father. Timothy Leary, psychologist, LSD proponent, and colleague of MK Ultra operative Aldous Huxley. Leary alleged in his book Flashbacks that Mary Pinchot Meyer confessed to taking LSD with JFK. Edward Epstein, author of Counterplot. James Fellon, Saturday Evening Post reporter. Ovid Damaris and Gary Wills, co-authors of Jack Ruby. Kitty Kelly, author of The Dark Side of Camelot, the article. Liz Smith, New York Post journalist. Frank Capel, author of The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe. Walter Winchell, gossip columnist. Gerald Posner, New York Times reporter and author of Killing the Dream and Case Closed. Peter Collier and David Horowitz, authors of The Kennedys and American Drama. Dan Moldea, author of The Killing of Robert F. Kennedy, an investigation of motive, means, and opportunity. Hugh Ainsworth, Dallas reporter. Norman Mailer and Larry Schiller, authors of Marilyn, a biography. Robert Slatzer, author of The Life and the Curious Death of Marilyn Monroe. John H. Davis, author of several books on the Bouvier and Kennedy families and the Mafia. Seymour Hersh, New York Times journalist and author of The Dark Side of Camelot, the book. Benjamin Bradley, senior editor of The Washington Post. Thomas Mayer, author and a producer of Mafia Spies. Bob Loomis, editor of Random House and the publisher of many of the JFK books supporting the Warren Commission's conclusions. And Gloria Loomis, Bob's former wife, and the secretary to CIA Chief of Counterintelligence, James Jesus Angleton. Mafia leadership and operatives. Meyer Lansky, leader of the Jewish mob, owner of Gambling Empire. Santos Trafficante Jr., Italian mobster tied to the Bonanno crime family. Johnny Roselli, Italian mobster for the Chicago outfit. Jack Ruby, or Jacob Rubenstein, assassin, mob operative, and known associate of Lee Harvey Oswald. John Martino, Cuban mobster tied to anti-Castro activists. Sam Giancana, Italian mobster and leader of the Chicago outfit. Carlos Marcello, Italian mobster and New Orleans crime boss. Mo Dalitz, Jewish mobster and casino owner known as Mr. Las Vegas. Jimmy Hoffa, mob-linked leader of the Teamsters Union. Mac Wallace, assassin alleged by former DNC chairman Clifton Carter of having been hired by LBJ to assassinate the president. Charles Harrison, contract killer and father of Hollywood actor Woody Harrelson. And Rose Cheramy, drug smuggler connected to Oswald and Ruby. She died in a mysterious car crash in 1965. Cheramy said about Oswald and Ruby, "Them two queer sons of bitches, they've been shacking up for years." Israeli state actors and their American proxies, including the Anti-Defamation League and B'nai B'rith. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, considered the primary founder of the Zionist state of Israel. Levi Eshkol, the third prime minister of Israel. Isser Harel, former director of Mossad. Meyer Amit, former director of Mossad. Julia Sheps, director of the Dallas Citizens Council, who invited JFK to Dallas, and a member of B'nai B'rith. Abraham Zapruder, member of B'nai B'rith, who filmed JFK's assassination. And David Weisblatt, the co-owner of the Dallas Textiles building, the suspected location of the actual shooters, and a financier of the Anti-Defamation League. And finally, Brown Brothers Harriman executives and clients, Bilderbergers, members of the Suite 8F group, and members of the Dallas Citizens Council. Prescott Bush, the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman, son-in-law of former Brown Brothers Harriman CEO George Herbert Walker, father of future CIA Director and 41st President George H.W. Bush, and grandfather of 43rd President George W. Bush. Alan Dulles, General Counsel to Brown Brothers Harriman and Sullivan and Cromwell. Robert Lovett, Senior Partner at Brown Brothers Harriman. Robert B. Anderson, Senior Partner at Brown Brothers Harriman. William D. Pauley, former U.S. Ambassador to Brazil and owner of Southern Air Transport, a known CIA front company. Howard Hughes, the founder of the Hughes Aircraft Company, now part of Raytheon, Boeing, and General Motors. H.L. Hunt, the founder of the Hunt Oil Company and member of the Dallas Citizens Council. Clint Murchison Sr. and Clint Murchison Jr., Dallas oil tycoons and owners of the Dallas Cowboys. R.L. Thornton, former mayor of Dallas and member of Dallas Citizens Council. Douglas Jaffe, co-owner of Dallas Textiles Building and financier of LBJ. Sam Bloom, chair of the Dallas Citizens Council and advertising agency head. Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce, media moguls and owners of Time Inc., now part of Warner Brothers Discovery. Catherine and Philip Graham, owners of The Washington Post, now owned by Amazon founder Jeff Bezos. George R. Brown, founder of Brown and Root Construction, now part of Halliburton. John Connolly, governor of Texas and Dealey Plaza shooting victim. Billy Sol Estes, Texas grain storage, fertilizer, and cotton plantation titan. The descendants of John D. Rockefeller, including David Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller III, and Nelson Rockefeller, the future unelected vice president of the United States. Descendants of J.P. Morgan. Descendants of E.H. Harriman, including W. Averill Harriman, founder of Brown Brothers Harriman and former governor of New York. The descendants of Alexander Brown. The descendants of E.I. DuPont, including Irene DuPont and William DuPont Jr., the descendants of Meyer Amschel Rothschild, and the British royal family. So how did all of this go down? How was the cabal able to cover up the killing of the President of the United States in broad daylight?
Telephone conversation between President Johnson and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover on November 29, 1963 at 1:40 p.m.
Yes.
J. Edgar Hoover on 2192.
Are you familiar with this proposed group that they're trying to put together on this study of your report and other things? Two from the House, two from the Senate, somebody in the court, a couple of outsiders.
No, I haven't heard of that. I've seen the reports on the Senate investigating committee that they've been talking about.
Yeah, well, we think if we don't have, I want to get by just with deer filing your report.
I think it'd be very, very bad to have a rash of investigations.
Well, the only way we can stop them is probably to appoint a high-level one to evaluate your report.
Yeah.
And put somebody that's pretty good on it from that I could select out of the government and tell the House and Senate not to go ahead with the investigation.
Yes.
Because they get up there and get a bunch of television going, and I thought it'd be bad.
It'd be a three-ring circus.
What do you think about Allen Dulles?
I think he would be a good man.
What do you think about John McCloy?
I'm not as enthusiastic about McCloy. I knew him back in the Patterson, when Patterson was down here, the secretary thing. He's a good man, but I'm not so certain as to the matter of the publicity that he might seek on it.
Mm-hmm. What about General Nordstad?
A good man.
I guess Boggs has started in the House. I thought maybe I might try to get Boggs and Jerry Ford in the House, and maybe try to get Dick Russell and maybe Cooper in the Senate.
Yes, I think so.
I don't know. You know anything? Any reason? Just talking to me and you're going to talk like brothers.
Yeah.
No, brother is. Any reason? Any there? I thought Russell could kind of look after the general situation, see that the states and their relations.
Russell would be an excellent man.
And I thought Cooper might look after the liberal group.
Who's that?
Cooper from Kentucky.
Oh, yeah, Cooper.
So they wouldn't think that he's a pretty judicious fellow,
Yeah.
but he's a pretty liberal fellow.
Yes.
I wouldn't want Javits or some of those fellows on it.
Javits plays the front page.
Cooper's kind of border state.
Yes.
It's not the South. It's not the North.
That's right.
Do you know Ford from Michigan?
I know of him, but I don't know him.
All right.
I saw him on TV the other night for the first time. He handled himself well on that.
You know Boggs?
Yes, I know Bob.
He's kind of author of the resolution. That's what I
Yes, I know him.
Now, Walter tells me, Walter Jenkins, that you've designated Deke to work with us like you did on the Hill.
I have, yes.
I tell you, I sure appreciate that. I didn't ask for it because I knew you knew how to run your business better than anybody else. And I just want to tell you, though, that we consider him as high class as you do, and it's a mighty gracious thing to do, and we'd be mighty happy. And we salute you for knowing how to pick good men.
What you just heard is a telephone conversation between President Johnson and FBI Director Hoover. The call took place 1 week after JFK's assassination and 5 days after Oswald's. In this conversation, the two men collaborated on the members of the Warren Commission and confirmed for the historical record that there was no conspiracy in President Kennedy's murder. Now, in the U.S. justice system, murder investigations are typically determined by a jury trial made up of 12 impartial citizens. For some reason, when the president was murdered, his successor and the head of the FBI decided to investigate via Executive Order 11130 in a committee of 7 Washington, D.C. elites. Weird flex, but okay. The first elite selected was, of course, former CIA Director Alan Dulles. A good man. The fact that he also happened to be an individual with the means, motive, and opportunity to kill President Kennedy? Minor details, right? Dulles would later tell author Willie Morris, quote, "I'm glad the little shit is dead. He thought he was a god," end quote. The commission was named after committee member Earl Warren, then the Chief Justice of the United States. Naming it after the Chief Justice helped legitimize the commission for the public. More importantly, the moniker concealed the fact that the commission was actually directed by Alan Dulles. President Johnson persuaded Earl Warren to head the commission. LBJ told Warren they needed to conceal the fact that JFK and RFK had put together the CIA's S-Force assassination team to kill Fidel Castro. This was a lie, as the S-Force had in fact been formed by Richard Nixon when he served as Eisenhower's vice president. Next up, we had John J. McCloy. Hoover wasn't quite as enthusiastic about McCloy, but this choice must have been above his pay grade because McCloy still made the commission. McCloy had served as Assistant Secretary of War during World War II, President of the World Bank, U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, Chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, now part of J.P. Morgan Chase, and Chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. His son, John J. McCloy II, would go on to become a partner at asset management firm Brown Brothers Harriman. Dulles, Warren, and McCloy were joined by Gerald Ford, then a Republican congressman from Michigan. Perhaps as a reward for his efforts in concealing the truth about JFK's assassination, Ford became the unelected vice president of the United States in December of 1973 after Spiro Agnew was forced to resign over a bribery scandal. 8 months later, Ford became the unelected president of the United States when Richard Nixon was also forced out due to Watergate. The final three members of the Warren Commission were Dick Russell Jr., a Democratic representative from Louisiana, Hale Boggs, a Democratic senator from Georgia, and John Sherman Cooper, the Republican senator from Kentucky. Russell was the first commission member to publicly dissent from Dulles' final report, as he agreed with Governor Connolly's assessment that both Connolly and Kennedy could not have been hit with the same bullet. Russell had attempted to resign from the Warren Commission in a letter to LBJ on February 24, 1964, after he realized the nefarious intent of the commission. Russell's resignation was refused by LBJ, so Russell stopped going to commission meetings. Senator Russell wrote a dissenting opinion in the Warren Report as he believed there was a conspiracy to kill the president. His opinion was not included in the final report. Boggs and Cooper later joined in Russell's dissent. Congressman Boggs planned to introduce a bill reopening the investigation into JFK's assassination. However, before he could do so, an Alaskan flight he was on between Anchorage and Juneau disappeared. Military and civilian aircraft searched the area for weeks, but no trace of the plane was ever found. Assistant Counsel Arlen Specter supported the Warren Commission as a young attorney out of Yale Law School. Specter developed the single bullet theory and would go on to become Pennsylvania's longest-serving senator, representing the state for 30 years. The Warren Commission was operating on behalf of one of the cabal's true centers of power, asset management firm Brown Brothers Harriman. Brown Brothers had been founded by 16 partners, 11 of them Yale College grads. Of those, 8 were members of the Skull and Bones Society. In the following clip, Daniel Sheehan describes the men at the center of this organization. Sheehan is a constitutional and public interest lawyer, political activist, and professor who investigated the Watergate burglary while at the law firm of F. Lee Bailey. Sheehan here mentions the Anderson Trust, which was a $1.2 trillion stockpile of gold, platinum, silver, and jewels stolen by the Japanese Empire during World War II. At the end of the war, Edward Lansdale, then head of Army Intelligence in the Philippines, learned of the location of this treasure by torturing General Tomoyuki Yamashita's personal driver. The trust was then used by the cabal to finance their illegal black operations.
The key to this is Brown Brothers Harriman, okay? In that there's this whole series of private investors that are part of this. And remember, the CEO of this is George Herbert Walker, okay? And that when he leaves and goes over to found the Union Bank of New York, okay, that he has his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, become the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman. And the people that you're dealing with in here is J.P. Morgan, who you'll remember, who's chief of staff. McGuire is the guy that attempted to organize the military coup against Roosevelt in 1934. You have John D. Rockefeller here and David Rockefeller, who are Standard Oil of New Jersey and California, okay, which is what William D. Pauley, who he was exploring for down in Brazil when he was the ambassador to Brazil. You have in here Irene DuPont of the DuPont Chemical Corporation, that was the makers of gunpowder and explosives in military armaments. That you have in here. You got E.H. Harriman, okay, and Averill Harriman. The kind of people that you're talking about here, they referred to themselves in Brown Brothers Harriman referred to themselves as high income individuals. That these are people with at that time over $50 million minimum each in order to qualify to be clients for Brown Brothers Harriman. They have to have $50 million of personal wealth in order to be their private investors. And then you need to understand that they're directly linked with, as I said before, is Sullivan and Cromwell. Okay? In that you have major business guys like here's United Fruit Corporation, which in fact leads down to Cromwell being involved in he's the guy that helped overthrow the Panamanian government in order to establish the Panama Canal down here. And so that this power elite that we're talking about here is critical for you to understand, because the senior partners in this include, as I said, Robert Lovett and Robert B. Anderson, who are two of the senior partners, who are two of the trustees to the Anderson Trust. Okay, and which remember is $1.2 trillion that they have here, and this is the core of the group that we're talking about, because Robert Lovett is the guy that headed up the Lovett Commission, which is the first group to recommend the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency at the end of World War II. So that these people here are and remember that up here the attorney for them is Allen Dulles. He's the attorney for Brown Brothers Harriman. And Allen Dulles is made the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And they have this thing, the Covert Operations Directorate. Okay? And the Covert Operations Directorate is functioning directly under the principles of the Doolittle Commission, who is William D. Pauley. He's the one that was actually asked to put together the team that was there. And one of the other guys that was on this group was, in fact, the business partner of John J. McCloy. And John J. McCloy is the third of the trustees, who actually, in the 1934 Olympics, sat in the box in Germany with Adolf Hitler. And here, Allen Dulles, legal counsel for Brown Brothers Harriman, is the guy who sat in the meeting on January 3rd of 1933 in Germany and authorized Adolf Hitler becoming the Chancellor of Germany on the condition that he would agree to repay the loans that had been given to Germany at the end of World War I by the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay? So that what I'm suggesting is that the chart that you're going to see on Thursday is going to have other tentacles from it. But this is the core of the cabal that we're talking about here, in that you get stars here of Alan Dulles and William D. Pauley, and over here is George Herbert Walker, okay, and guys like Robert Lovett. These are crucial operations agents of this cabal. But these people just sit in their boardrooms. And these are the ones who own the shares of stock. These are the men who remain immune from any personal legal liability, because they have created, and their fathers have created, the concept of the corporation, where the corporation exists and the owners of the shares of the corporation are immune from any liability for anything that they do. And the management are immune from anything the corporation does legally. And they're legally immune from anything the corporation does. And the board of directors members are immune. So in effect, these people serve as the board of directors. These are the board of directors basically for the cabal. And these other folks are operational people. George Herbert Walker, Alan Dulles, William Pauley, Lovett. These people are the field commanders. They're basically the majors, if you were in the military. These are the majors that are actually field commanders that are getting things done out in the field. And others remain the colonels above them. For example, Prescott Bush, in addition to being the CEO for Brown Brothers Harriman, was elected to be a United States Senator from Connecticut, and he served in the United States Congress as the major liaison to the Congress from the Central Intelligence Agency after it was created in 1947. That Prescott Bush would be made aware of particular covert operations that were going to be undertaken by Alan Dulles here in his capacity as the CIA director, that he would advise Prescott Bush, because Prescott Bush was in fact the CEO of the Brown Brothers Harriman, of which Alan Dulles was also the general counsel. And so he would tell Prescott Bush about what the covert operations were, and Prescott Bush would decide who in the United States Senate and who, if anybody, in the House of Representatives were to be briefed about covert operations that were going to be undertaken by the Central Intelligence Agency. And so what you see here, without it becoming too terribly complex, you see the core of the operation that is underway here. And that Dulles maintains his authority, which got him appointed to be the first civilian director of the Central Intelligence Agency, because of his position here. And so that even though Kennedy terminated him in the fall of 1961, following the debacle in the spring of the Cuban invasion at the Bay of Pigs, he still retained his full power as what the term that you should be using is the consigliere. He is the consigliere for this operation, for the cabal. And the consigliere is the Italian word that the mafia has for a wartime legal counsel. That's who he is. He is the wartime legal counsel. And that's the key to Dulles. So Dulles, one of the things that you'll discover in your legal practice after you all go to law school is that the lawyers end up telling their clients, for the most part, what to do, because the lawyers are the ones that are advising their clients as to what they can get away with. So even though these are the people that benefit financially, and these are the people who have the disposition to want a certain thing to happen, it's their consigliere and the consigliere's law firm that are in fact the ones calling the shots. Because they'll tell you what it is you can get away with, and they'll tell you which dispositions you have ought to be pursued. And that's the role that Dulles has here. And that's the role that Sullivan and Cromwell played. And that's why I would recommend to you probably getting a copy of the book, A Law Unto Itself. The book, A Law Unto Itself, is the story of Sullivan and Cromwell. And to understand that Sullivan and Cromwell is just not a normal law firm. This is a law firm that has been specifically and consciously set up to promote and foster the imperial ambitions of the investment clients to Brown Brothers Harriman. Okay? And that they also have access to the Central Intelligence Agency to engage in the kind of activities that they need to have engaged in order to foster and promote their imperial ambitions of basically securing privileged access to the strategic raw materials that these corporations that they own need to have in order to continue to foster and promote profits for themselves. These people were capable of garnering access to such a high percentage of the resources around the planet and had put together an industrial complex that was able to engine an economic system that could generate adequate resources to be able to hold for themselves, basically, half of all the value that they gained from doing this, but they could distribute the other 50% of the value out to the regular American people. And it would kind of filter down through the economic system, except for, of course, the black people and the Latinos and the other people who most of these people thought ought to be actually eliminated from the gene pool anyhow, which is exactly what the attitudes were that they had. It's the white man's burden. It's manifest destiny. They were very clear about what their ideology was.
As Sheehan mentioned, William D. Pauly is the man who had commissioned the Doolittle Report, published 7 years after the creation of the CIA in 1954. The report set to establish the policy and approach for the Central Intelligence Agency, which was nothing short of ruthless. The report stated, quote, "It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the United States is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. We must develop effective espionage and counter-espionage services and must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective methods than those used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy." End quote. Pauly was ready to throw out long-standing American concepts of fair play, advocating a fundamentally repugnant philosophy when it came to President Kennedy. Sheehan was involved in the Iran-Contra investigation and learned that both Pauly and Time Life's owner, Claire Luce Booth, had been financing the shipment of weapons to the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. The weapons were paid by the CIA's heroin trafficking, going through the Golden Triangle via the Sicilian and Corsican mafia.
The contraband was being moved using Pauly's cargo airline company, Southern Air Transport, a known CIA front company. The unit running the operation were known as the Flying Tigers. Claire and her husband, Henry Luce Booth, were openly supportive of fascist governments in the overthrow of Castro. So much so that they sent the Miami station chief of Life magazine, Dick Billings, on a mission with Pauly as part of Operation Tilt. Billings later shared a story with Daniel Sheehan about his time with Pauly in the summer of 1963. Pauly had assembled 10 members of the S-Force as part of Operation Tilt to proceed with the assassination of Fidel Castro in direct contradiction to President Kennedy's orders to stand them down. Billings and his life photographer were brought onto Pauly's yacht, the Flying Tiger, to be able to record the event and to photograph Castro's dead body. This mission launched on June 18th with Santos Traficante's Lieutenant John Martino and William Rip Robertson, the field commander for the S-Force. The night of June 19th, Billings, Martino, Robertson, Pauly, and others remained on the yacht while the assassination team deployed. I'll let Daniel Sheehan take the story from here.
They're all on the ship still, and they go back in the Flying Tiger, and they re-anchor at Hognose Reef, waiting for these guys to come back. And they're there that night. This is the night of the 19th now of June of 1963, and they're all on this yacht. And this yacht is mounted with a .50 caliber machine gun on the front prow of this boat. And in what William Pauly and John Martino and Rip Robertson and Dick Billings and Rudy Enders and a number of these other folks start getting drunk. And John Martino and they start throwing. They're fishing off the side of the boat, and they catch a fish, and they start reeling in one of the fish, and a shark attacks it. And so William Pauly gets up on the .50 caliber machine gun and slaughters the shark. And other sharks start to come because of all the blood. And then he starts killing all these sharks with his .50 caliber machine gun and killing a dozen sharks and blood flying and everywhere. Then he takes out his .45 and starts killing them with like this. The fucking guy's a maniac. You got to understand what we're talking about here. I mean, this is William D. Pauly, the guy that wrote the Doolittle report about how we had to develop a capacity to be more ruthless than our enemies. And this guy's out of his mind, basically. And he's doing this crazy stuff, and they get that thing all ends up calming down, and they're on board drinking still, Jack Daniels, and getting utterly shit-faced and talking to each other. And John Martino starts becoming livid about Kennedy. And what a dirty bastard he is, and how he's betrayed us, and he's jumping up and down about this. And here's Dick Billings standing there with Rip Robertson and John Martino, with Martino jumping up and down, and William D. Pauly standing there. And Martino is calling Kennedy no good traitor, son of a bitch, and he's jumping up and down. And William Pauly turns to him and says, "Don't worry, John, we're going to kill that motherfucker."
Don't worry, John. We're going to kill that motherfucker. What do you think William D. Pauly could have meant by that? We don't know what happened to the S-Force operatives that went to Cuba the night of June 19th, 1963, but they never returned to Pauly's yacht. Castro survived the assassination attempt, and President Kennedy never learned about the failed coup. But 5 months later, his assassination operation would end much more tragically than Castro's had. Much of this cabal's power connects to dark, illicit commerce. This includes the slave trade, which we now refer to as human trafficking, drug smuggling, and gun running. Eustace Mullins wrote the following passage in Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Mullins' book was originally published in 1952, 11 years before JFK's assassination. He updated the book's final edition in 1991. Quote, "The most powerful American banking houses actually take their direction from London. Their history is a fascinating one, and unknown to the American public, originating as it did in the international traffic in gold, slaves, diamonds, and other contraband. There are no moral considerations in any business decisions made by these firms. They are interested solely in money and power. Tourists today gape at the magnificent mansions of the very rich in Newport, Rhode Island, without realizing that not only do these cottages stand as a memorial to the baronial desires of our Victorian millionaires, but that their erection in Newport represented a nostalgic memorialization of the great American fortunes which had their beginnings in Newport when it was the capital of the slave trade. The slave trade for centuries had its headquarters in Venice until 17th century Britain, the new master of the seas, used its control of the oceans to gain a monopoly. As the American colonies were settled, its fiercely independent people, most of whom did not want slaves, found to their surprise that slaves were being sent to our ports in great numbers. The preeminence of J.P. Morgan and Brown in American finance can be dated to the development of Baltimore as the 19th century capital of the slave trade. Both of these firms originated in Baltimore, opened branches in London, came under the aegis of the House of Rothschild, and returned to the United States to open branches in New York and to become the dominant power not only in finance, but also in government. In later years, key posts such as Secretary of Defense have been held by Robert Lovett, partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, and Thomas S. Gates, partner of Drexel & Company, a J.P. Morgan subsidiary firm. The president, George H.W. Bush, is the son of Prescott Bush, a partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, for many years the senator from Connecticut and the financial organizer of Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, of which he was a director for many years. Alexander Brown came to Baltimore in 1801 and established what is now known as the oldest banking house in the United States, still operating as Brown Brothers Harriman of New York, Brown Shipley and Company of England, and Alex Brown and Son of Baltimore, now part of Raymond James. The behind-the-scenes power wielded by this firm is indicated by the fact that Sir Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England for many years, was a partner of Brown Shipley and Company. Considered the single most influential banker in the world, Sir Montague Norman was organizer of informal talks between heads of central banks in 1927, which led directly to the great stock market crash of 1929. End quote. Brown Brothers & Co. merged with Harriman Brothers & Company in 1931 to form Brown Brothers Harriman & Co., the name under which this asset management behemoth operates today. The merger brought together the Old World Brown family money of banking, money laundering, and slave trading with the New World Railroad money of the Harriman dynasty. The cabal has consolidated their stranglehold of the economy over the centuries. Today, they do so by controlling the asset management cartel, including BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Brown Brothers Harriman, and Rothschild & Co., the banking cartel, including J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, and Morgan Stanley, the central banking cartel, including the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve System, and the European Central Bank, and the International Financial Institutions cartel, including the Bank for International Settlements, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. The cabal infiltrated their puppets into every level of American government in the decades following World War II. Simultaneously, they used the weapons of military, intelligence, corporatocracy, and organized crime to subvert the sovereignty of foreign countries in preparation for one world government. The cabal's pawns included Lyndon B. Johnson, who served as president for 5 years after JFK's murder. LBJ then passed the torch to Richard Nixon, another operative, who was forced to relinquish the throne to Gerald Ford, another operative. The baton was passed back to the blue team when Jimmy Carter took office in 1969. Carter was a man easily controlled by leaders of the deep state, including Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor and the father of the neocons, David Rockefeller, chairman of Chase Manhattan, and Robert Russa, partner at Brown Brothers Harriman. Ronald Reagan's two-term administration followed, in which Reagan continued his acting career and pretended to serve as commander-in-chief. In practice, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, controlled the federal government during those 8 years. Bush, the former CIA director and son/grandson of two past CEOs of Brown Brothers Harriman, continued the cabal's devious plans. In 1993, Bush passed the baton back to the blue team when his close friend Bill Clinton and Bill's wife, Hillary Clinton, came into office. Prescott Bush's grandson, George W. Bush, then took the baton back for the red team in 2001. W. Bush played a similar role as Ronald Reagan. George W.'s vice president, Dick Halliburton, Cheney was really the man in charge during those 8 years. The high priests of neoconservative neoliberal ideology removed the red robes for blue ones again in 2009. Barack Sobarka Obama and his spouse, Michelle Obama, came into power. Obama's vice president, Joe Biden, returned to the White House as acting president in 2021 alongside his vice president, Kamala Harris. The Biden-Harris administration have been working to incite war with Russia and Ukraine ever since, completing the mission VP Biden started during the Obama years. These deep state operatives continued to profiteer from organized crime over the decades. They continued Brown Brother Harriman's long legacy of human and drug trafficking. Their sordid web of evil has been held together by blackmail, thirst for power, and pedophilia. Survivors of MKUltra and other debaucherous black operations have testified that the cabal's crimes extend beyond the rape of children to include the ritualistic abuse, torture, and murder. As unbelievable as that may sound, the number of survivors providing testimony and the similarities in their experiences cannot be dismissed. Victims who have spoken out about the ritualistic abuse they suffered from perpetrators I just named include Fiona Barnett, Richard Nixon, Kathy O'Brien, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Jack Valenti, and Arlen Specter. Alexander Peter Chernoff, George H.W. Bush, and Arlen Specter. Paul Bonacci, George H.W. Bush. Jesse Marie Zepitar, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Barack Obama. And Ally Carter, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, and Joe Biden. Kathy O'Brien, her daughter Kelly, and Alexander Peter Chernoff testified about another of these human trafficking, child raping psychopaths, Robert C. Byrd. You know, the Dixiecrat senator from West Virginia / Ku Klux Klan leader who mentored young Joe Biden when he first entered the Senate. These MKUltra survivors testified that Senator Byrd had, quote, an unusually small penis size, end quote. I only bring up Byrd and provide this context so that I can say to the late Senator Byrd, go fuck yourself with your micropenis, you depraved psychopath. In 2018, Fiona Barnett provided her testimony to the International Tribunal for Natural Justice's Commission on Human Trafficking and Child Sex Abuse. Her story is extremely challenging, but helps us to understand the depths of evil perpetrated by the organized crime syndicate that murdered President John F. Kennedy.
My name is Fiona Barnett. I was born Fiona Ray Holozak, or it's pronounced Holubczyk in Polish, on the 28th of October 1969 in Sydney, Australia. I am a victim of child trafficking through the CIA, Luciferian ritual abuse, and Project MKUltra. Child trafficking is run as a single integrated world operation. This operation is coordinated by the CIA in collaboration with British and Australian intelligence services. Retired NYPD Detective James Rothstein was appointed to the first US task force to investigate this child trafficking operation, which, he found, went all the way to the White House. Detective Rothstein found that the CIA were behind a blackmail operation in which child prostitutes were used to honey trap and compromise politicians, military brass, top businessmen, and key government officials. Rothstein, who arrested the key Watergate perpetrator, said Watergate solely concerned this human compromise racket and specifically was an attempt to obtain a list of compromised pedophile VIPs and their proclivities that was held at the Democratic National Headquarters. I personally spoke with Rothstein, who said he knew of an identical VIP pedophile ring that existed back here in Australia during that time, and that an Australian intelligence officer named Peter Osborne knew the details of this. The Australian wing of this child trafficking operation is coordinated by ASIO, which is the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation. It's the Australian equivalent of the CIA. During the 1970s and 80s, Labor Party politician Kim Beazley Sr. headed ASIO's child trafficking operation. Under Kim Beazley's administration, I was prostituted at age 6 years to a pedophile orgy at Parliament House in Canberra, where I was raped by then Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, Attorney General Lionel Murphy, and Governor-General John Kerr. During the same excursion, future Prime Minister Bob Hawke raped me in a suburban backyard near Canberra, and former President Richard Nixon raped me in the back of a USA CIA military plane at Australia's main military airport, the one where Air Force One lands if it visits Australia. After this, I was child sex trafficked from Sydney Airport to California, USA, in a cargo plane. I was gassed and stuffed in a wooden crate like an animal. During this trip, I was raped by media founder Ted Turner at a pedophile party held at Disneyland, and I was trafficked to the annual summer camp at Bohemian Grove, attended by notable politicians, businessmen, and other VIPs. I was raped by Reverend Billy Graham in a pink bubble-themed cabin at Bohemian Grove. Billy Graham told me that his good buddy Richard Nixon had recommended me to him. At Bohemian Grove, I was one of a group of children dressed as teddy bears and hunted for sport by men in the forest to the theme song Teddy Bear's Picnic. I also witnessed the ritual murder of a woman by male guests dressed in black Luciferian robes. I will now lay the foundations for explaining the relationship between pedophilia, child trafficking, ritual abuse, mind control practices, and the CIA's Project MKUltra. I was handed over to the CIA child trafficking network by my paternal grandparents, Helen and Peter Holozak, who resided at 14 McAllister Avenue, Engadine, a suburb located in the Sutherland Shire, south of Sydney. Peter and Helen Holozak were amongst the large number of Slavic Nazi war criminals granted asylum by the Australian government through the International Refugee Organisation. Numerous Nazi war criminals settled in an area south of Sydney, which ran from the Sutherland Shire to Wollongong. These people worked and orgied together, just as they had done back in Nazi Europe. They carried Slavic, Germanic, or Anglicised versions of their former surnames. The Holozaks sought refuge from retaliation from the Allies for their collaboration with the Nazis. From when I was 6 years old, Peter Holozak bragged to me about killing Jews for a living in the Nazi death camp located in Lublin, Poland. Helen was pursued by the Russians for her role in the Gestapo. Her father spent 2 years in a Siberian work camp for refusing to disclose Helen's whereabouts to the Russians. What people must appreciate is that the Nazis were Luciferians. During their height of power, the Nazis conducted Luciferian rituals in broad daylight in the streets of Germany. Luciferianism is a secret, multi-generational religion with its roots in ancient Babylon and Egypt. Luciferians worship various ancient pagan gods, most importantly Lucifer, but also Moloch, Baal, Dagon, Imhotep, Horus, Isis, Anubis, and Seth. Nazism drew out and promoted those Slavics who secretly practiced Luciferianism. My grandparents and the other Slavic war criminals who were granted asylum in Australia congregated here to covertly practice their brand of Nazi Luciferianism in Australia. Over time, the descendants of these Luciferian pedophile refugees collaborated with existing Luciferian dynasties such as the Kidmans, Conlins, Overtons, Huxleys, Cardins and Cumpstons, and infiltrated Australian government and influenced Australian law and policy. Luciferianism is arranged according to a hierarchical structure which vaguely resembles a caste system. At the very top sit 13 family dynasties, including the Rothschilds and the British royal family. These are recognised by cult members as demigods. Below these lines sit approximately 300 Luciferian bloodlines who are generally high IQ, although this tends to have been watered down in some families due to intermarriage. Below this group sit the commoners who can never attain higher status because they lack the desired bloodline. These are your random covens based on nationality. For example, there's a strong Scottish coven in Bundaberg, which is a major centre of Luciferian activity in Australia. They can be organised according to sexual orientation. For example, Bond University, where I attended and was attacked, has a strong lesbian coven. And gang membership, such as the bikie gangs, or you can just now have your self-styled whatever goes covens these days. It is from these lower lines that the cult obtains breeders, women who are forced to breed unregistered babies for sacrifice and sex trafficking. We refer to these bottom feeders as coven scum. Their behaviour is usually barbaric and requires constant management to stop them exposing the cult, and they show no respect for those in the caste above them. There is much jealousy and animosity directed by these lower members toward the bloodliners. Child rape, torture and murder are routinely practiced within Luciferianism for various reasons. One, these acts are established traditions thought to appease their god Lucifer. Two, some members get off on raping and murdering children, but not all members. The ones who like it were conditioned to be sexually aroused by it through being abused and exposed to such practices as children. Three, it is believed to bestow power on the practitioner. Sodomy is called the fountain of youth and is thought to transfer the child's youth to the abusing adult. Luciferianism is a cult. Cult indoctrination alone is a strong enough influence on human behaviour. But the impact of indoctrination is reinforced by fear of the consequences of betraying or exposing the cult. The number one role of Luciferianism is there is no such thing as Luciferianism. At age 6 years, I was well taught this lesson. I was taken into a national park. There I witnessed a man who was called a traitor have each of his four limbs tied to four different vehicles which drove at high speed in opposite directions. That incident taught me to never talk about the Luciferian cult in which I was raised. Mind control is a Luciferian tradition stemming back thousands of years. Luciferian offspring are trained in witchcraft, astral projection, and psychic manipulation of the physical elements, among other things. Children are tested at age 3 for whether they should be raised with conscious or dissociative awareness of their cult involvement. Children with strong ethical objection to cult practices are never made aware of their involvement. These children are forced to dissociate through trauma and their minds fragmented. My husband and I were two such children. You cannot possibly understand their pervasiveness unless you were raised in their world. I will now explain the link between Luciferianism and the CIA's Project MKUltra, demonstrate the existence of Project MKUltra in Australia, and identify key MKUltra perpetrators and MKUltra abuse locations. MKUltra sub-projects were conducted in most Australian hospitals, universities and research facilities throughout the 1960s, 70s and 80s. MKUltra's presence in Australia stemmed from a 1951 security military agreement between our country and the USA. This agreement led to the establishment of the Australian Atomic Energy Commission in 1952 and the construction by the same US company of two multi-storey underground CIA research facilities, one at Lucas Heights in 1958 and one at Pine Gap in 1967. Pine Gap served as the endpoint for all data collected over Australia. Sydney University was the centre of Australian MKUltra research. MKUltra university-based research was kicked off in Australia by CIA psychiatrist and hypnosis expert Martin Orne. MKUltra experiments and Entangled procedures were conducted using children as lab rats. These child victims were sourced from Luciferian covens, various cults, boys' town homes, Derrick Boys Home, government and church-run juvenile detention centres, child protective services, foster care, police lockup, Catholic churches, child prostitution brothels, blackmailed pedophile parents, and Hillsong Church that was founded by New Zealand pedophile Frank Houston. Some children were kidnapped off the streets. Other children were specifically bred to serve as human lab rats, their births not registered. Children were imprisoned in cages beneath Holsworthy and never saw daylight. Children were tortured, raped and murdered in the name of national security with the full knowledge and blessing of the Australian and United States governments. As George White wrote to Sidney Gottlieb in 1971, quote, "It was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? End quote. There were two main categories of CIA child trafficking victims. One, those considered dispensable and destined for murder, and two, those deemed useful on a long-term basis, which was a fate worse than death. I was in the latter group. The Nazis recognised Luciferian-based esoteric knowledge and techniques as a power source that they sought to weaponise. That is why they travelled the globe collecting esoteric knowledge and techniques from the pedophile Dalai Lama and other Nazi collaborators. Major Louis J. West coordinated MKUltra experiments at UCLA. Documented in mainstream newspapers and magazines, including Psychology Today, these experiments involved behavioural conditioning of autistic children using cattle prods, physical violence, and electrocution via an electrified metal floor. West hired Ivar Levasse to conduct the experiments, who in turn regularly consulted the father of operant conditioning, B.F. Skinner. I reiterate, child trafficking is run as a single integrated world operation. This operation is coordinated by the CIA. I bring your attention to a 1978 book entitled Dope Inc. or Dope Incorporated. The latest edition of this book was published in 2010, but I highly recommend the 1978 version, which is available free online. This book revolutionised the way drug law enforcement officers consider drug crime. It led to the HSBC Bank losing its licence to operate in the USA. Dope Inc. authors found that drug trafficking is run as a single integrated world operation, from your cartels right down to the person who sells drugs to junkies on the street corner. This operation started with the Opium Wars, where the British monarchy forced China to accept heroin produced in India. Two well-recognised organisations stemmed from Opium Wars. P&O Cruise Ship Line was established to transport the heroin, and the Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC Bank, was established to launder the drug money. The court Jews that served the British monarchy, including the Rothschilds, managed the drug money that was made from this trafficking operation. Dope Inc. then explains how the drug trafficking and related money laundering operation established in the Opium Wars is the exact same operation in existence today. In fact, HSBC was only in recent years fined by USA authorities for still engaging in drug money laundering. If you follow the money trail, it still leads back to the British monarchy. This is the same British monarchy that I witnessed engage in Luciferian ritual crimes in 1980 at St. James Anglican Church in Sydney. The book Dope Inc. devotes a chapter to explaining the British aristocracy's involvement in an ancient Egyptian cult, how Britain started the drug, rock and roll counterculture in the USA with the help of the CIA, and the links between Egyptian cult practices, the counterculture, and the CIA, which was established by British intelligence. Dope Inc. explains how and why the CIA run modern drug trafficking and money laundering as a single integrated world operation. When you read Dope Inc., if you cross out the words drugs and insert the word kids, then you have a picture of the CIA child trafficking organisation that violated my human rights.
As difficult as Barnett's testimony is to hear, it's important to understand the reality of the rulers. How is it possible that this Luciferian cabal has maintained this secret? That these monsters have been engaging in child sex abuse and blood ritual for millennia? That drug and human trafficking is maintained as a single integrated world operation? They've been able to maintain this secret the same way they've concealed the truth about JFK's assassination. The cabal has always owned and controlled the media. The 1975 Church Committee, formerly the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, exposed widespread subversion of the free press by the intelligence agencies. Here is what Lisa Pease wrote about the sordid relationship in her essay, James Angleton, Part 2. Quote,
People sometimes create an artificial distinction between powerful men in the Eastern establishment and those in the CIA. These people mixed often at parties, they dined together, argued together, and on occasion worked together. As Harrison Salisbury noted, what really was more important than whether a piece of paper might turn up in the files of the Times or the CIA was an understanding of the personal relationships of the men who made the CIA and the men who made up the New York Times in those days. They were for the most part of the same social and geographic circle. They had married into each other's families. They were Yale and Harvard and Princeton. They were lawyers and bankers and businessmen and journalists. They were General Adler and Allen Dulles, Ben Wells and Walter Sullivan and James Angleton. They were John Oakes and his brother. They were Kim Roosevelt, the CIA man who pulled off the Mossadegh coup, and Sam Pope Brewer and Kenneth Love. They were James Reston and his deputy in the Washington Bureau until he left in 1961, Wallace Carroll, and Carroll's intimate friend, Richard Helms, with whom he had worked in pre-war UPI days in Europe. They were all the correspondents who had been wined and dined and flattered by Allen Dulles and Frank Wisner and Des Fitzgerald and Tracy Barnes, Reston, Daniel Frankel, and Drew Middleton and myself. They were Cy Salzberger and Frank Wisner and the Bobby Joyces and Allen Dulleses and Helms and Colbys and station chiefs all over the world. They knew each other, they stayed at each other's houses, they drank together and dined together and golfed together and traveled together and talked together, and they knew each other's secrets. A lot of them, anyway. The cordial relationship between press bigwigs in this group was not limited to the New York Times. Bill Moyers, McGeorge Bundy, Cord Meyer, Richard Salant, president of CBS News, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Paul Hens, CIA chief of station in Ethiopia, and Leonard Marks, director of USIA, the United States Information Agency, served together on a secret CIA task force. They explored a means to beam anti-communist propaganda into China in 1964. Journalists such as Jeremiah O'Leary and Hal Hendricks worked hand-in-hand with CIA propaganda chief David Atlee Phillips. CBS's founder and chairman of the board, William S. Paley, had a close relationship with Allen Dulles. Even Walter Cronkite had performed favors for the agency. Is it any wonder that the true story of JFK's assassination has never emerged in the press, given the tight relationship between the agency and even highly visible, well-respected journalists? End quote. As I discussed in Globalism versus Self-Governance, the cabal has used the weapons of corporate consolidation and blackmail, amongst others, to control the legacy media. Today, 6 media conglomerates, National Amusements, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Comcast, News Corp, and Sony control 90% of the media produced in America. Similarly, the cabal's influence has been pervasive in big tech since the beginning of Silicon Valley. It's only been in recent years, thanks to independent journalists and free speech platforms like X, Substack, Rumble, Telegram, independent book publishers, and podcast platforms, that the flood of truth has broken through its suppression. We are finally close to truth and reconciliation in President John F. Kennedy's assassination. It is also for this reason that the public is finally confronting the truth about the scourge of human trafficking and the elites involved in it. As I discussed in Who's Hillary Rodham Clinton, the Pizzagate scandal that erupted following WikiLeaks' 2016 release of John Podesta's emails was one of the most important events in American history. A crossing the Rubicon moment for the American public where the cabal was completely exposed, and the public came together to reject the sacrifice of our children to the cult of Baphomet. I'll be revisiting the Pizzagate scandal in future episodes, but in the meantime, I'll leave you with a teaser and ask, what is walnut sauce? I'll point you to a very interesting 2015 Huffington Post article called Hillary Clinton Holds Off-the-Record Journalist Dinner Ahead of 2016 Announcement by Michael Calderone. This article provides a clue as to why the media suppresses the truth about human trafficking. Excerpts include, quote, Hillary Clinton's campaign team held an off-the-record dinner Thursday night in Washington, D.C. for roughly 24 journalists and staff members at John Podesta's house, according to sources familiar with the matter. Podesta, the campaign chairman and a seasoned cook, made a pasta with walnut sauce for the dinner guests, which included reporters from The New York Times, The Washington Post, Politico, The Wall Street Journal, The Associated Press, Bloomberg, McClatchy, Reuters, and several major TV networks. Clinton herself did not attend the dinner.
but several key Clinton staffers, including campaign manager Robbie Mook, Chief of Staff Huma Abedin, Communications Director Jennifer Palmieri, Strategic Communications Advisor Karen Finney, Advisor Mandy Grunwald, and pollster Joel Benenson were there. A Clinton spokesman declined to comment on the gathering. End quote. What do you think they could be talking about in this article? And if the deep state is tied together by a child-murdering, Luciferian death cult, if they'd be so bold as to strike down the sitting president of the United States in broad daylight, what do you think they'd be willing to do when his brother threatened to finish the job of dismantling their depraved organized crime syndicate? Who assassinated Robert F. Kennedy? The cabal faced a massive threat during the election of 1968 when Robert F. Kennedy entered the race. RFK had the integrity, wisdom, name recognition, and popular support to not only win the election, but to also finish the job his brother had started in dismantling the globalist conspiracy. For these reasons, RFK's life was taken at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles on June 5, 1968. Investigative journalist Lisa Pease has spent the last 30-plus years investigating RFK's assassination, and you'll be shocked to learn his murder probably wasn't the result of a crazed lone gunman named Sirhan Sirhan. In her book, A Lie Too Big to Fail, The Real History of the Assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, Pease provides evidence that, at a bare minimum, 12 bullets had to have been fired in the pantry, which is an issue given Sirhan's gun only held 8 bullets. The evidence suggests that Sirhan, who has maintained that he cannot remember any of the events of that night, was hypnotized, likely drugged, and possibly shooting blanks as a distraction for the real assassin. Further, there were at least 4 guns fired, including the one fired by the man who almost certainly murdered Robert Kennedy, Thane Eugene Caesar. Caesar was a self-described plumber who had worked at Lockheed Corporation in their Skunk Works facility, where they manufactured the CIA's top-secret spy planes, and at Hughes Aircraft, another known CIA hotbed. Thane Eugene Caesar was an employee of Ace Security Guard the night of RFK's assassination, part of the team hired by the Ambassador Hotel to protect Bobby Kennedy. Caesar was hired by Ace just days before the assassination in May 1968. The company had been formed earlier that year by Frank J. and Loretta M. Hendricks. Caesar was just behind and to the right of Kennedy at the time the shots were fired. Autopsy evidence showed that all 4 bullets that entered Kennedy's body and clothes were fired at a distance no greater than 6 inches. The final shot to the head was fired at a distance of no more than 2 inches. Yet all of the eyewitness testimony put Sirhan's gun at a range of 1.5 to 3 feet from Kennedy. Sirhan would have had to be standing considerably closer to Kennedy's head to have produced the stippling patterns found during the autopsy. Kennedy's proximity to Caesar is demonstrated in a famous photograph taken after RFK's murder, in which Bobby grabbed onto Caesar's clip-on tie after being shot. The tie was ripped off Caesar's shirt, lying just outside of reach from Bobby's hand in the photo. Caesar made many statements that he later contradicted, adding to the suspicion of his sinister involvement. For example, he told police that he had sold his .22 before the assassination and that he had lost the receipt. But the police found the receipt and learned that he had sold the gun after the assassination. Caesar was one of the first to accurately pinpoint where RFK had been shot. Most thought he'd been shot in the head, whereas Caesar said right after the murder that he'd been shot in the head, the chest, and the shoulder. Caesar's suspected co-conspirators include Michael Wayne, or Ween, a bookstore clerk also in the pantry that night, and John Corey, a law school student. Wayne and Corey had enough question marks in their past and during the evening of June 5, 1968, to make one ask, are these guys CIA operatives? And what role did the other Ace security guards play in the assassination? What about Augustin Mallard, the man who arrested and handcuffed Wayne that night due to his suspicious behavior? Was Caesar telling the truth when he told documentarian Ted Chirach, there were 3 of us guards who had their guns out when the shooting began? There were also 4 or more individuals in polka dot attire at the Ambassador Hotel that night. Were they CIA handlers for the operation? Was a coordinated attire used for the plotters to recognize one another? Was the pattern relevant for triggering Sirhan Sirhan in his hypnotic state? And what are we to make of Eugene Hale Brading, aka James Lee, and Jim Braden, the man who was arrested and interrogated coming out of the Ambassador Hotel after RFK's assassination? who coincidentally had also been arrested and interrogated when he came out of H.L. Hunt's office in the Dow Tex building directly behind JFK on the day of JFK's assassination. Weird coincidence, huh? The assassination team was likely operating under the direction of Robert Mayhew. Mayhew, an ex-FBI and CIA agent, also had close ties to the Mafia. Mayhew had hired Johnny Roselli on behalf of the CIA for the planned assassination of Fidel Castro. Mayhew was likely supported by CIA operatives Howard Hughes, the aerospace oligarch who likely funded JFK's assassination, and James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence. Counterintelligence is a euphemism for propaganda, deception, psychological warfare, and social engineering. The assassination team had help in the cover-up from LAPD criminologist Dwayne Wolfer. Wolfer was the corrupt head of LAPD's crime lab with a long track record of tampering with evidence. Wolfer and the LAPD's Special Unit Senator, or SUS unit, were instrumental in the cover-up of RFK's assassination. Years after, Wolfer would become president of ACE under its new name, ACE Security Services. Neat coincidence, huh? The SUS unit included Charles Higbee, formerly of Marine Corps Intelligence, Frank Patchett, formerly of the Navy, Lieutenant Michael Pena, formerly of CIA Front USAID, and Sergeant Enrique Hank Hernandez, an alleged CIA asset. The cover-up was likely supported by District Attorney J. Avell Younger, formerly one of Hoover's top agents in the FBI, and part of the OSS's counterintelligence unit. Propaganda, deception, psychological warfare, and social engineering. What role did Sirhan's defense attorney play in the cover-up? Grant Cooper. What influence did the intelligence agencies have over Dan Maldea in his authorship of Case Closed, which used shaky claims to support the lone gunman conclusion? Was hypnotist William Joseph Bryan telling the truth when he bragged to prostitutes that he worked for the CIA and had hypnotized Sirhan? Coincidentally, Bryan called into the Ray Bryan KABC radio show just hours RFK's assassination and mentioned Sirhan was likely operating under some form of hypnotic suggestion. Another curious character who'd been seen at Kennedy's California campaign HQ shortly before the assassination is an Iranian man named Khyber Khan Gudarzian. Khan had been seen in the company of Sirhan before the assassination and was reported to have been acting suspiciously by numerous Kennedy campaign volunteers. This suspicious activity included filling out over 20 volunteer cards for his friends using his own address as their contact information. Coincidentally, Khan gave Michael Wayne a ride to the Ambassador Hotel the night of RFK's assassination. Khan's father had been executed by the Shah of Iran's father when Khan was 8. Khan may have been killed as well, but a British family working on behalf of oil interests adopted him. Khan was educated in Scotland and in 1944 joined British military intelligence. In 1948, his Iranian title was restored and he ran a fleet of taxicabs, a fleet of trucks, and a repair shop. He also worked for the Anglo-American Oil Company there and maintained close ties to the American and British governments. Fred Cook, in his book The Nation, noted, "The Khyber Khan's role in the Iranian counter-coup that toppled Mossadegh is not quite clear, but indications are that he helped." Despite the Shah's father's role in Khan's father's death, Khan and the Shah became friends, with the Shah even providing Khan with a villa on the palace grounds. The two split over funds meant to be used for a new sports arena. The Shah then discovered Khan's Cadillac was wiretapped to the hilt and that he had a major spy in his midst. Khan was warned of the Shah's discovery and fled the country. But Khan maintained the spy network he had built, through which he discovered some fascinating information. $7 million of the sports arena's funds had been redirected to the Pahlavi Foundation, the Shah of Iran's family's personal fund. Khan's agents investigated where the money went after hitting the foundation's account and made some startling discoveries. Turns out that in 1963, days before the Shah was to meet with President Kennedy, the Pahlavi Foundation had cut the following checks. Alan Dulles, former CIA director, $1 million. Henry Luce, owner of Time Life, $500,000. David Rockefeller, president of Chase Manhattan Bank, $2 million. Mrs. Loy Henderson, $1 million. George V. Allen, $1 million. Selden Chapin, $1 million. Henderson, Allen, and Chapin had all served as U.S. ambassador to Iran. Richard Helms, a man we'll return to shortly, served as Johnson and Nixon's CIA director. After the CIA, he took a role in the U.S. State Department. Guess which one? Ambassador to Iran. Helms happened to have been a childhood friend of the Shah's, as they both attended the same Swiss school in their youth. These elites sure do run in small circles, huh? David Rockefeller, Allen Dulles, and Henry Luce had contributed to the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, on August 19, 1953, an effort double-headed by the CIA and British intelligence. The coup strengthened the monarchical rule of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Do you think there's a relationship between the intelligence agency's subversion in Iran 60 years ago and the current instability in the Middle East? The Pahlavi Foundation's funds also made their way to the Shah's family members and to high-level British officials. In total, Khan provided photocopies of 137 checks, face side only, ranging in an amount from $100,000 to $2 million, and the total amount of $102 million for that year, 1962. The information made its way to Congress and the public when Fred Cook published this information in the nation's expose. Given the seriousness of Khan's accusations, he was called to testify under oath to 3 sessions of the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, then headed by Senator John L. McClellan, a Democrat from Arkansas. Instead of investigating the highfalutin names from Khan's disclosures, Congress and the McClellan Committee instead launched an all-out assault on Khan to discredit him and destroy his credibility. The Senate would ultimately reject Khan's claims. Lisa Pease writes in her essay, The RFK Plot Part 2, Rubik's Cube, quote, "What had started as Khan's crusade to regain money that was to be used for Iran turned into an ugly, losing battle. Khan was a very resourceful man and knew how to play on a winning team. It seems highly unlikely that he continued forever his fight against the Shah, and more likely that he gave in to the old adage of, if you can't beat him, join him. And a man with Khan's resources could not be allowed to become an enemy of American intelligence. He had too powerful of a network. One can't help but wonder if the CIA took an interest in protecting the actions of their own, Dulles, Rockefeller, the Shah, et al., while using Khan for their own purposes." End quote. Lyndon B. Johnson and Richard Nixon were both most likely aware and supportive of RFK's assassination before it took place. Pease and others have argued that LBJ's decision not to run for a second full term absolves him from suspicion in the RFK case. However, this fails to recognize that individual useful idiots operating on behalf of the cabal are subservient to the demands of the syndicate. Further, the public would have been highly suspicious if LBJ had become president twice in the wake of Kennedy brother assassinations. And by enlisting provocateurs / likely intelligence assets like Abby Hoffman at the 1968 DNC convention, they could swing the election to Republican candidate Nixon, another establishment operative, and shift suspicion away from LBJ. Therefore, LBJ begrudgingly exited the race in early 1968, just as we saw Joe Biden do in 2024 after his hands were forced by the elites behind the curtain. Finally, it's worth digging into the role played by Howard Hughes, owner of Thane Eugene Caesar's former employer, Hughes Aircraft, and CIA operative Robert Mayhew. In 1968, Mayhew was overseeing a great deal of Hughes' operations. Mayhew had previously served as the CIA's liaison to the Mafia, specifically mobster Johnny Roselli, in orchestrating assassination plots. A CIA document dated 1974, but not released until 1994, states the following. DCD, Domestic Contacts Division, has had close and continuing relationships with the Hughes Tool Company and Hughes Aircraft Company since 1948. Both companies have been completely cooperative and have provided a wealth of information over the years. It should be noted that in the case of Hughes Aircraft, DCD has contacted over 250 individuals in the company since the start of our association and about 100 in Hughes Tool over the same period. The substance of the contracts ranged from FPI collection to sensitive operational proposals. In addition, there is some evidence in DCD files that both companies may have had contractual relationships with the agency. In the context of such a broad range in Hughes/CIA relationships, it is difficult to state with certainty that the surfacing of the substance of a given action would not cause congressional and/or media interest. End quote. Here's Daniel Sheehan describing some of the CIA operations Hughes funded and the ties between Cuba and JFK's assassination.
In 1958, all during 1958, and earlier from 56 to 58, a movement began in Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, an attorney. This is another recommendation for law school. An attorney along with Che Guevara and Fidel's brother, Raul Castro, and 5 other major comandantes that were undertaking a revolution against this fascist dictator, Batista. And Batista, as I said, was business partners with Santo Trafficante, the Don of the Mafia in Havana, and business partners with the Sea Supply Corporation and Paul Helliwell. He was partners, in effect, with the Central Intelligence Agency. And they functioned in Havana as a critical link in the covert operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, because they had this flow of heroin coming into Cuba and being then transported up into the United States and sold in the United States. And it was a major source of funding for their covert operations. And so that when Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara and the others rose up against Batista, who was in fact a total authoritarian, who was imprisoning people and torturing people and assassinating people, all of that activity that was going on, they rose up against him and they overthrew Batista on New Year's Eve of 1959. And Batista fled from Cuba, and along with Batista, all the leaders of the mafia and the other fascist supporters of Batista in Cuba fled with them. And so there was this huge flight went on out of Cuba from New Year's Eve of 1959 all the way through January and early February of 1959. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these extreme right-wing, pro-fascist elements and mafia people from Cuba fled up out of Cuba, came the 90 miles up into southern Florida, and they established themselves in Miami and in Tampa. And they set themselves up, and they created a virtual expatriate government in Miami, in Tampa, in exile against the new Cuban government, the revolutionary government in Cuba. And what happened is Richard Nixon, in his position as the head of the 5412 Committee, immediately got Eisenhower to sign on to, had no trouble getting the agreement of the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, that was Allen Dulles, to issue an ultimatum to Fidel Castro, telling Castro that if the new Cuban revolutionary government were going to be given any kind of diplomatic recognition by the United States, they would have to agree to have absolutely no diplomatic relations with either Russia, that's the Soviet Union, or China. They had to have absolutely no diplomatic relations with them whatsoever. And if, in fact, they didn't agree to do that, not only would the United States give the new Cuban government no diplomatic recognition, they would begin to boycott them. They would basically set up an embargo against Cuba, and they would attempt to destroy the economy of the Cuban government. And that ultimatum was issued by Richard Nixon. Fidel Castro told him to go pound sand, and that he wasn't going to abide by that. And right away, Richard Nixon from the 5412 Committee began to mobilize a covert operation inside the operational directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency that was called Operation 40, was the code name for it. And it was based in Miami, on the campus of the University of Miami. And it wasn't disguised all that well. It was set up to operate out of this old airplane hangar on the campus of the University of Miami. They assigned a number of CIA trained officials that had been trained at the fish farm by the Central Intelligence Agency between 1947 now and 1959. They had a whole 12 years of classes that had come out. And what they did is they set up a set of paramilitary bases. One of them on No Name Key, this key off Florida. Another one on Swan Island, just off the coast of Florida. One of them in the Everglades of Florida, and two of them in Louisiana, one at the southern end of Lake Pontchartrain and the other at the northern edge of Lake Pontchartrain. And the Central Intelligence Agency's Covert Operations Directorate began to supply military equipment, military trainers to these people. And all through the latter half of 1959 and into the first half of 1960, this 1 year period, this Operation 40 began to function against the new Cuban revolutionary government. And so Eisenhower, at the end of his 2 terms, had to leave office in 1960. So Richard Nixon announced his candidacy for the Republican nomination. And there was a major contest going on in the Democratic Party for the Democratic Party nomination. Adlai Stevenson was competing for the nomination. He had lost twice to Eisenhower. And this young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, announced his candidacy as well for the Democratic Party nomination. The principal contest going on inside the Republican Party for the nomination was between Richard Nixon and Nelson Rockefeller. And there were efforts to get Henry Cabot Lodge to compete as well. So that this activity was going on throughout the first half of 1960, during which Operation 40 was in full swing, going against the island of Cuba. And what the CIA did is, out of that base of Operation 40 on the campus of the University of Miami, they were recruiting right-wing, pro-fascist Cuban exiles that had fled from Cuba and members of the mafia. And that they were mafia people, mafia gunmen, extreme right-wing Cuban exiles, and a number of all Cuban organizations began to form. The 506 Brigade, the 2506 Brigade, they had about a half a dozen of these rabidly anti-communist, pro-fascist, kind of authoritarian private organizations sprung up all around Miami and Tampa. And they were ripe recruiting grounds for Operation 40. And so Operation 40 had like over 1,000 people working for it. And they were engaged in these paramilitary strikes against the island of Cuba from these 5 paramilitary bases, each one of which had a CIA liaison officer working directly with them, training them and helping to supply the military equipment, helping to make plans for them, etc., and actually going on missions with them in some instances. And they would blow up bridges. They'd sneak into Cuba. They'd go down in the boats across the 90 miles, and then they would go ashore, and they'd blow up bridges, and they'd set fire to entire fields of sugar cane. They would poison shipments of sugar that had been put on ships to go to Russia. They would poison the sugar, hoping to poison people in the Soviet Union and disrupt any relationships with Cuba. So this whole operation had been going on for the better part of a year, from the middle of 1959, after Fidel Castro rejected the ultimatum that had been put to him by Nixon and the Eisenhower-Nixon administration, and so that the campaign started moving into high gear in both parties. And in June of 1960, Nelson Rockefeller withdrew from the Michigan primary, and upon that withdrawal, Richard Nixon knew that he was going to win the Republican nomination. And he was convinced that whether John F. Kennedy or Stevenson or whoever it is that won the Democratic nomination, that they weren't going to have a chance against him. He'd been the vice president of the United States for 8 years. Had been the United States senator. Had been the congressman from California. He thought that he was going to win. So what he did is he reached out in a secure telephone conversation in June through the NSC, a 5412 committee. He contacted Howard Hughes, who had become a classified resource person for the National Security Council following his invention of the spruce goose. There's this big long thing, you can look it up. But anyway, he was this rather brilliant guy and a major adventurous aviator, and he designed and built the prototype of the C-5A cargo plane called the Spruce Goose, this gigantic cargo plane made out of spruce wood. And he showed that this gigantic, almost like ocean liner-sized airplane could actually fly. And he flew it, and the people were all telling him he was crazy. This was before he was crazy. And so he got fed up with them all and basically gave them the finger and walked off the public stage, which he was quite prominent on, not unlike Donald Trump. He was a big bravado guy that bought a studio in Hollywood and married Hollywood actresses and cruised around in Las Vegas and did all these crazy things. And he got so upset at the way the media treated him over his designing and building of this C-5A cargo plane that he basically left the public eye, and he became a secret resource for the National Security Council. And he created this company called the Summa Corporation, in which he built technology for the National Security Council to undertake covert operations, one of which was the Glomar Explorer, that was a huge ocean-going vessel that was capable of reaching all the way down to the bottom of the ocean in picking up a damaged Russian submarine, if one happened to occur, and that they could recover the Russian submarine and bring it aboard and then get at all the secret technology in the Soviet submarine, and a number of other major covert operations, the sensitivity of which was extraordinary, I will tell you, because I've become aware of what some of them were that he was doing with him, but it doesn't do you any good to know those things right now. But the bottom line is he had developed this extraordinarily sensitive position with the National Security Council. And so what happened is Richard Nixon, in June of 1960, after realizing that he was going to become the nominee for the Republican Party, he gets on the secret telephone and he contacts Howard Hughes on his version of the telephone and tells Howard Hughes that Richard Nixon wants to have an assassination team put together. And he wants Howard Hughes to do this so that it will keep it away from the president, referring to himself. He began to refer to himself as the president in the third person, much like Donald Trump refers to himself as Donald Trump. And so he said that I want to have this assassination team put together, and I want to keep it away from the president. And I want the team to assassinate Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and the other 5 comandantes of the new Cuban revolutionary government. But I don't want to hear anything more about it. And in the telephone call, Howard Hughes did not agree to do this or disagree with him. He just listened to him. And after hanging up, Howard Hughes then calls in to his office in Las Vegas. It was either the Sands Hotel. I think he had the whole top floor. He bought the Sands Hotel, and he was living in the top floor of the big penthouse suites. And he called Robert Mayhew, one of his new young lawyers, in, and told Mayhew that the president getting ready to be president, Richard Nixon, which they all assumed was going to happen, that he was going to get elected, wants to have us put together this assassination team and wants to have it kept away from the White House. And so I'm tasking you with getting this done. And so Bob Mayhew, the lawyer for Howard Hughes, reached out there in Las Vegas to Johnny Roselli. And Johnny Roselli was the bagman in Las Vegas to the Flamingo Hotel and another couple of them that the mob owned there. And he was the bagman for Sam Giancana. Sam Giancana was the Don of the Mafia in Chicago, second in power only to Santos Trafficante, who was the Don in Havana that sat astride this heroin trafficking that they had going on for the CIA and themselves. And so Johnny Roselli, after a second meeting with Bob Mayhew, this one out in California at the Brown Derby, actually, where they met, and then they had a secret meeting, and Sam Giancana was contacted by Bob Mayhew and his bagman, Johnny Roselli, and they came from California, and they went to Chicago, and they sat down with Sam Giancana, Bob Mayhew, and Johnny Roselli, and they pitched this proposal to him from the president. They kept referring to Nixon as. And Sam Giancana stated that he was not opposed in principle to doing this because as Bob Mayhew pointed out to them, you guys, that's how they refer to them, use guys, have your own reasons for wanting to get rid of these SOBs, down there in Cuba. They've closed down all your casinos. They've closed down your heroin trafficking operation. They've closed down all your houses of prostitution. You've got your own reason for wanting to get rid of them. So would you do this? And so they sit down and they have this conversation in Chicago, and Sam Giancana says, look, I'm not opposed to doing this, but this is, if we do this, kill Castro, the Castro brothers and Che Guevara and the others, that's down in Santos Traficante's territory. So he has to consent to this. And so they fly down, and they have a series of 3 meetings at the Fontainebleau Hotel in late June and early July of 1960. And in the 3rd meeting, Sam Giancana ends up persuading Santos Trafficante in principle that he'll agree to do this. But he said he wants to make sure that Santos Trafficante wants to make certain that this isn't some pipe dream of Howard Hughes or even worse yet, Robert Mayhew. He wants to make sure that this is coming from Nixon. So he insists upon having someone come to the next meeting and give them the green light to go ahead and do this. And in the 3rd and final meeting, a man shows up at the 3rd meeting using the code name Mr. Ed, and it turns out it's Sheffield Edwards. And Sheffield Edwards is the chief of security for the Central Intelligence Agency under Richard Nixon, and as the vice president and chair of the 5412 committee, and under Allen Dulles. And Sheffield Edwards gives them the green light to go ahead and do this. So they set up the assassination team, and in Santos Trafficante, as he said to us later in May of 1973, when we were talking with him about this, actually through our chief investigator at the Bailey firm, of whom he was a client, he said that, look, I didn't fall off no melon wagon, he said. And so what I decided I was going to do is, in putting this assassination team together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a number of my former gunmen out of Havana that were there to protect our casinos and our houses of prostitution and the heroin trafficking, who have now been recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency down in Miami to be part of Operation 40. So what I'm going to do is put together the assassination team made up of 15 of these anti-Castro Cuban exiles who are part of Operation 40, but who are my guys, really. And so he did. So he puts together this 15-man team that they codenamed the S Force. S is in Sam. and they put together the S-Force of 15 people, and they were made up of guys like Rafael Chichi Quintero and Ricardo Chavez and the Villaverde brothers. There are a whole bunch. We got their names. There's 15 of the guys. Okay, and they put them all together, and they're all spread out actually in these 5 paramilitary camps that have been operating as Operation 40. And so there are like 2 or 3 of them in each one of these places, but they're spread all around. And so what happens is they send a private plane to get them, and they will then fly them together. They fly them to Fort Huachuca in Arizona. And at Fort Huachuca, they sign in at Fort Huachuca, and then they just disappear. And it turns out that they were brought by private plane from Fort Huachuca, flown down into Mexico, into Oaxaca, Mexico. And they land there at a landing strip that's at the ranch of a fellow named Clint Murchison Jr., actually. And his father, Clint Murchison Sr., is the one who owns the Dallas Cowboys. At that time, it was called the Dallas Texans. And they also own the Santa Anita racetrack in California, which is where J. Edgar Hoover and Clyde, whatever his name is, who was his friend and deputy director of the FBI, used to go and spend long weekends together and be given free betting on the horses at Santa Anita. And so that this ranch that exists down in Oaxaca, Mexico, they fly them down there, and they have a triangular fire team base training facility there at the ranch. And these 15 men are trained in triangular crossfire assassinations with high-powered rifles to assassinate the Raul Castro and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and the others. And that activity is going on. And the way that it's financed, this is all given to us by Santos Traficante, who set the whole thing up, tells us all about it. And that what they would do is they would skim cash off the casinos in Vegas that were owned by the mob. They would skim the cash off, and they would put this cash in these very expensive suitcases, and then they would put the suitcases into the trunk of these Cadillac, brand new Cadillac automobiles, and they would drive them from Las Vegas all the way through New Orleans and then into Miami. And they would deposit the cash in the Miami National Bank, which is the national bank that's owned by Meyer Lansky, who is the treasurer for the mafia. And they put the money in the banks, and then they would wire the money to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, owned by this guy by the name of Gaillon. And that they would put the money in, they would wire the money into the bank, and then they would wire portions of the money to different places. And one of the places that they would wire part of the money to was into the Banco Internacional in Mexico City. And they would put the money, wire it into this account of an attorney by the name of Ogario down in Mexico City. And that's where they were funding the activities of the Triangular Fire Team Base out of Oaxaca, Mexico. And that whole operation was underway in the second half of 1960. And the campaign was then going on. Nixon did get the nomination for the Republican Party, and John F. Kennedy got the nomination for the Democratic Party. And they went on into the fall, into October, and then they had the television debates, the now famous 2 debates, the first ever televised presidential debates in American history. And so Kennedy ends up winning, theoretically, setting aside the issue of the votes in Chicago that there's some serious question about. But the bottom line is that Kennedy ends up beating Richard Nixon by the smallest margin, one of the smallest margins in American political presidential history, and then ascends to the presidency. And when he becomes president, he is briefed for the first time that there is a dimension of Operation 40 that he had not been told about, and that was that there was a plan afoot that as soon as Richard Nixon was to have been elected president, he was going to authorize the Central Intelligence Agency and the anti-Castro Cuban exiles that were manning these 5 paramilitary bases in southeastern United States. He was going to authorize them to stage an invasion of Cuba, that they were going to go ashore at a place called the Bay of Pigs, and they were going to go ashore and they were going to immediately hoist a flag of the free Cuban government, and the Richard Nixon administration was going to give diplomatic recognition to that new government of Cuba, and then they were going to send in the United States Marines behind them to militarily overthrow the government, the revolutionary government of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro and Che Guevara. That was what the plan was. But when Kennedy was elected, he refused to go along with that. He refused to allow any United States military forces to be deployed against the island of Cuba. Now, this sounds like it'd be a perfectly logical and appropriate thing for him to do, but the fact of the matter is, as General Smedley Butler pointed out in the readings that you read, that the United States had in fact deployed U.S. military forces into Latin America and into the Caribbean, 24 times in the previous 100 years. And so that it wasn't anything extraordinary that the Central Intelligence Agency and this clique of people, this cabal that was instrumental in creating the Central Intelligence Agency and putting together this entire paramilitary operation that was functioning on behalf of their interests, they thought. But here's this guy, John Kennedy, who basically takes this kind of self-righteous position that he's not going to allow any U.S. military forces to be directly deployed against the island of Cuba. And so Allen Dulles, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Richard Bissell and a number of others who were in the Miami station, they tell him, well, look, here's what's going to happen is as soon as we land our 400 guys on the beach and announce the new free Cuban government, all the people of Cuba are going to rise up against Fidel Castro in this revolutionary government. They're going to rise up and they'll overthrow the government. And so Kennedy says to them, fine, if that's what your assessment is as the CIA, then you go ahead and do what you were going to do, and you put these 400 guys ashore, and if the people rise up and overthrow the government of Fidel Castro, once it's established, we'll recognize it. But what happens is the plan all along on the part of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles, in the deputy director, in Bissell, the station guy down in Miami, what they had intended to do is they were going to go ashore, and then what they were going to do is completely contrary to the direct orders of Kennedy. They were getting the commander of the Guantanamo naval military base down in Guantanamo to actually send out naval ships to place them just offshore of Cuba and manned with United States Marine Corps guys. And what they were going to do is they were going to go ashore and assuming that they were going to get their butt kicked, if they got caught, then they were going to confront Kennedy and say, look, you've got to turn the Marines loose to save face because you're going to be humiliated because our guys are all going to get their butt kicked, and you're going to be responsible for it. And they planned to trap Kennedy into having to do this. And so what happened is on, April 17th, I think it was, April 17th of 1961, just after he came into office. He's sworn into office on January 21st of 1961. This launches on April 17th. And what happened is, it's one of the great fiascos of the many of all time.
When the Bay of Pigs invasion went south, as Dulles and Bissell had planned, they went to Kennedy and pushed him to send in the Marines who were just offshore. JFK refused to be extorted and did not send the Marines into Cuba. About half of the men on the invasion team were killed, the rest were captured. President Kennedy was humiliated by the fiasco, and he accepted the public's blame. Privately, he blamed his CIA leadership and fired Alan Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cabell because of the Bay of Pigs. Did the S-Force take vengeance on President Kennedy 2 years later? Was his brother's assassination 5 years after that another Hughes and Mayhew operation? To end this discussion on RFK's murder, I'd like to share Lisa P's conclusion to the essay, The RFK Plot 2, Rubik's Cube. Quote, Bobby Kennedy had more enemies, it would seem, than his brother. Where John Kennedy played the politician, Bobby Kennedy played the populist. A famous episode recounted by Richard Goodwin shows how radical Bobby had become. The State Department had threatened to cut off aid to Peru over a dispute Peru had with the International Petroleum Company, a Standard Oil subsidiary. Kennedy had been outraged at the State Department, saying, Peru has a democratic government. We ought to be helping them succeed, not tearing them down just because some oil company doesn't like their policies. But when Kennedy was confronted with what he considered excessive anti-Americanism from a Peruvian audience, Kennedy turned the tables on them. Goodwin recounts what transpired as follows. Irritated by the attacks, Kennedy turned on his audience. Well, if it's so important to you, why don't you just go ahead and nationalize the damn oil company? It's your country. You can't be both cursing the U.S. and then looking to it for permission to do what you want to do. The U.S. government isn't going to send destroyers or anything like that. So if you want to assert your nationhood, why don't you just do it? The Peruvians were stunned at the boldness of Kennedy's suggestion. Why, David Rockefeller has just been down here, they said, and he told us there wouldn't be any aid if anyone acted against International Petroleum. Oh, come on, said Kennedy. David Rockefeller isn't the government. We Kennedys eat Rockefellers for breakfast. Bobby had outraged the CIA by exercising heavy oversight after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Richard Helms, Johnson's then CIA director, the friend of the Shah and a key MKUltra backer, held a special animosity for Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby was the one who asked, immediately after the assassination, if the CIA had killed his brother. What might Bobby have uncovered had he been allowed to reach the office of the presidency? Powerful factions hoped they'd never have to find out. Kennedy himself expected tragedy for his efforts. I play Russian roulette every time I get up in the morning, he told friends. But I just don't care. There's nothing I could do about it anyway, the fatalist explained, adding, This isn't really such a happy existence, is it? The assassination of both Kennedys guaranteed the elongation of our involvement in Vietnam, a war that personally brought Howard Hughes and everyone involved in defense contracts loads of money. Killing Bobby prevented any effective return to the policies started under John Kennedy and prevented Bobby from opening any doors to the truth about the murder of his brother. And killing Bobby removed a thorn in the side of many in the CIA who felt he had treated them unkindly and unfairly. Who killed Bobby? One man gave me an answer to that. I interviewed John Meyer, a former bagman for Hughes and by association the CIA. Meyer was one of the tiny handful of people in direct contact with Howard Hughes himself. His position gave him entree to circles most people will never see. Meyer had worked for Hughes during the assassination and saw enough dealings before and after the assassination to cause him to approach J. Edgar Hoover with what he knew. For example, he knew that Thane Eugene Caesar had an association with Mayhew. Mayhew also had an extensive working relationship with the LAPD. This partnership produced a porno film pretending to show Indonesian President Sukarno in a compromising position with a Soviet agent. According to Meyer, Hoover expressed his frustration, saying words to the effect of, "Yes, we know this was a Mayhew operation. People think I'm so powerful, but when it comes to the CIA, there's nothing I can do." People will choose to believe what they believe, but the evidence is still present, waiting to be followed, if any entity has the fortitude to pursue the truth in this case to wherever it leads. And so long as Sirhan remains in jail, the real assassins will never be sought. End quote. Who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr.? Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination was blamed on lone gunman/scapegoat James Earl Ray. Ray was captured at London's Heathrow Airport 2 months after MLK's murder. Ray was an escaped convict, supporter of segregationist George Wallace, and avowed racist. However, 30 years after his death, King's family won a wrongful death civil lawsuit against Lloyd Jowers. That lawsuit alleged King had been assassinated by a conspiracy that included government agencies. Jowers, the former owner of a Memphis bar and grill, was never the family's chief concern. Rather, the Kings were effectively charging U.S. intelligence agencies, particularly the FBI and Army intelligence, with organizing, subcontracting, and covering up the assassination. Jowers said the man who asked him to help in the murder was a mafia-connected produce dealer named Frank Liberto. Liberto had a courier deliver $100,000 for Jowers to hold at his restaurant, Jim's Grill, the back door of which opened to the Lorraine Motel where King was killed. Jowers also said he was visited the day before the murder by a man named Raul, who brought a rifle in a box. Nathan Whitlock testified to a conversation he had with Liberto in which he asked Liberto point blank if he had killed King, to which Liberto replied, "I didn't kill the N-word, but I had it done." Whitlock asked, "What about the other son of a bitch taking credit for it?" Liberto replied, he wasn't nothing but a troublemaker from Missouri. He was a front man, a setup man." Jowers testified that the assassination team included Memphis Police Department MPD officer Merrill McCulloch, MPD Lieutenant Earl Clark, MPD Homicide Chief N.E. Zachary, and Clark's unnamed partner. Jowers received a smoking rifle from Clark at the back of Jim's Grill right after King was shot. Raul picked it up the next day. Jowers said he didn't actually see who fired the shot that killed King, but thought that it was Clark, the MPD's best marksman. James Earl Ray's defense attorney on appeal, William Pepper, would later claim Clark's then unnamed partner, Frank Strausser, pulled the trigger. MPD intelligence agent Merrill McCulloch can be seen kneeling beside King's body on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in a famous photograph after the assassination. Another consideration for the true story of MLK's assassination. Is it possible he survived the assassin's bullet that night in Memphis? William Pepper argues he did. Here's Pepper in a 2018 interview a few years before his recent death.
The shot did not kill him. We all believed that Martin King was killed by that shot by Strausser. He was still alive when he was taken to the hospital. He was being worked on in the emergency room of the hospital. And I think the emergency staff were trying to do their best to keep him alive. And he was still breathing and alive. When the head of neurosurgery of the hospital, Dr. Breen Bland, came in to the emergency room with two other men in suits. And he said to the people in the emergency room, "Stop working on that nigger and let him die." And then he said, after a pause, "Now get out of here, all of you. Leave this room. Get out." And he emptied the room. And as he was emptying the room, a surgical nurse was the last one out. And she heard them do this, like picking up water in their mouths. And that caught her attention, and she turned and she saw them spit on the body of Dr. King, the three men. Then she saw Dr. Bland, take a pillow and put it over his face and suffocate him. And that's how Martin King was killed.
The jury unanimously agreed that there had been a conspiracy in King's assassination involving Jowers and others, including government agencies. The King family requested just $100 in damages to highlight that their interest in the case was for justice and not financial recompensation. Who else was involved in the assassination? Could he have been betrayed by other leaders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference on behalf of intelligence? The owner of the Lorraine Motel, Walter Bailey, shared a strange request with New York City police officer Leon Cohen the morning after King's murder. Bailey explained that the night before King arrived, he had received a call from a member of Dr. King's group in Atlanta. The caller, whom Bailey said he knew but referred to only by the pronoun he, wanted the motel owner to change King's room. Bailey said he was adamantly opposed to moving King from an inner courtroom behind the motel office, which had better security, to an outside balcony room exposed to public view. If they had listened to me, Bailey said, this wouldn't have happened. Who was the member of King's group in Atlanta who insisted on moving his room to the outside balcony? Do any of his SCLC colleagues on the balcony after King was shot, Andrew Young, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Reverend Ralph Abernathy, know the answer? And why had Reverends Jesse Jackson and Billy Kyles relieved King's security detail from the Memphis black nationalist group The Invaders just 15 minutes before he was assassinated? It's worth us revisiting the men and women closest to King at his death to understand who these individuals truly were. Were they actually moral authorities, as King claimed to be? Or had King's sojourns with subversives and organized crime drawn him into a pit of vipers? Why was King killed? Who benefited? Who has the power to cover it up? Who? Many have argued King's positions against the war in Vietnam had created powerful enemies within the military-industrial complex. That his efforts to unite the masses through the Poor People's Campaign threatened the economic control of the oligarchy. Others believed his Marxist economic policies, like advocating for the radical redistribution of wealth and the expansion of government, had exposed him as a communist to the ultranationalists. Did J. Edgar Hoover hate communism, and by extension King, to such an extent that the FBI had him taken out? We know that the FBI, likely Hoover's deputy William Sullivan, sent a letter to King in 1964 about his sexual misconduct, a letter which King believed was an attempt to extort him into killing himself. A few days before King received the letter, Hoover had denounced King at a press conference as the most notorious liar in the country. But as powerful, corrupt, and blackmailed as Hoover was, the decision to take out Martin Luther King Jr. would have exceeded his pay grade. In July of 1967, the CIA had assisted the FBI in creating a four-man team within the Memphis Police Department called the Domestic Intelligence Unit, or DIU. The DIU formed as part of COINTELPRO to infiltrate and undermine the Memphis-based Invaders, a black nationalist group run by Charles Cabbage and styled off of the Black Panther Party in the Bay Area. In January of 1968, Frank Holloman, a 25-year veteran of the FBI, was appointed as Chief of Public Safety in Memphis. In that role, Holloman managed the city's police and fire departments. Holloman had spent most of his FBI career in the South and 7 years in charge of Hoover's Washington office. The DIU, run by Lieutenant Eli Arkin, was Holloman's top priority. On March 28, 1968, a special detachment of Atlanta's 111th Military Intelligence Group, or MIG, a branch of the Army, was assigned to Memphis. This 20-member detachment was commanded by Major Jimmy Locke as part of a civil disorder operation codenamed Lantern Strike. Lantern Strike was, quote, a training exercise designed to facilitate the working relationship between the 111th MIG, the MPD, the Tennessee National Guard, and the FBI, and their common effort to monitor and disrupt any civil disorder that might arise in Memphis as a result of the sanitation workers' strike, end quote. Anyone else get Event 201 vibes from Operation Lantern Strike? As it turns out, there was civil disorder in Memphis. Dr. King arrived in Memphis the same day as the 111th MIG to lead a march organized by the predominantly black sanitation workers. The workers had been striking for several weeks. The march began at 11 o'clock, and within minutes, rioting broke out. Governor Buford Ellington called out the Tennessee National Guard at 12:30 p.m., and at 2 p.m., 16-year-old Larry Payne, a black high school student, was shot and killed by Memphis cops. The policeman claimed that Payne was attempting to loot a service station and had attacked them with a butcher knife. There were rumors that an FBI informant / undercover police spy in the Invaders had incited the riot, which led to Payne's death. It's now suspected that the informant was Memphis Police Department officer Merrill McCullough. McCullough was the same police officer who was first to arrive to MLK's body after he was shot 1 week later. Jowers would claim that McCullough played the role of liaison between the various elements of the assassination cabal. McCullough would stay with the MPD until he joined the CIA in 1974. When the American Civil Liberties Union filed suit against the city of Memphis in 1976, the MPD destroyed most of his police reports. How convenient. William Pepper, the attorney for the defense of James Earl Ray, later hired reporter Stephen G. Tompkins as an investigator on the case. Tompkins said the 111th Military Intelligence Group, whose Memphis mission was overseen by Colonel Edward McBride, shadowed King when he was in Memphis using a sedan crammed with electronic equipment. The situation in Memphis deteriorated after the death of Larry Payne, damaging Dr. King's reputation in his movement for nonviolence. There were wide rifts between blacks and whites and within the black community. For all of these reasons, Dr. King was forced to return to Memphis on April 3rd in advance of a second march scheduled for April 8th. In the years before the Jowers case, allegations and speculation on MLK's assassination the night after he returned to Memphis focused on 1. The withdrawal of the security detail assigned to Dr. King on April 3rd, 2. The removal of 2 African-American detectives on April 4th from the surveillance post of Fire Station Number 2, located across the street from the Lorraine Motel, and 3. The removal of 2 African-American firemen from the same firehouse on April 3rd. One of these detectives, MPD DIU member Edward E. Reddit, said he thought he'd been removed from his post because he would have been able to identify the man who actually pulled the trigger. Reddit had been removed from his surveillance post at Fire Station Number 2 just 2 hours before the assassination at the insistence of Philip R. Manuel. Manuel was a staff member of the U.S. Subcommittee on Investigations. Before joining the staff as an investigator, Manuel had spent his entire military career with the 902nd MiG, which William Pepper implicates in King's assassination. Pepper also implicates Manuel's boss, Senator James O. Eastland, the Democrat from Mississippi. Carthel Whedon, captain of Fire Station Number 2, later testified that on the morning of April 4th that he led 2 U.S. Army officers to the station's roof, a lookout for the Lorraine Motel. The officers, members of the 111th MiG, carried briefcases and said they had cameras. From the roof, they had a bird's-eye view of Dr. King's balcony doorway, the rooming house across the street from the motel where Ray allegedly shot King, and the bushes on the hill below the rooming house, which is a suspected location of the actual shooter. Judge Joe Brown, who presided over James Earl Ray's appeal in 1998, would later claim the shooters were not in the rooming house or the bushes below, but rather the dormitory of Fire Station Number 2. Sergeant James Green of the 111th MiG later admitted to being on the roof that day. Green claimed he could not recall the name of the other agent with him that day. When the daily reports of the 111th and 902nd MiG were requested from the Pentagon, the military claimed to have lost the records. How convenient. How come that line never worked with my homework? William Pepper also claimed that 2 members of an Army Special Forces team, codenamed Warren and Murphy and attached to the Alabama National Guard, were on the roof of the Illinois Central Railroad building overlooking the Lorraine Motel. They were part of an 8-man sniper squad whose assignment was to shoot the protest leaders, including King, if rioting broke out. Warren provided information linking the 902nd MiG to the mafia crime family of Carlos Marcello, Mystery Man Raul, in the assassination of Dr. King. It was also discovered there had been Green Berets alongside the military intelligence agents in Memphis when King was killed. What were they doing there? J.D. Hill confessed that he had been a member of an Army sniper team in Memphis assigned to shoot an unknown target on April 4th. After training for a triangular shooting, the snipers were on their way into Memphis to take up positions in a water tower and 2 buildings when their mission was suddenly canceled. Hill said he realized the team must have been part of a contingency plan to kill King if another shooter failed. J.D. Hill was later shot to death under suspicious circumstances. Donald Wilson was a 25-year-old FBI agent in Atlanta when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. He was the first agent to James Earl Ray's abandoned white Mustang in an Atlanta parking lot in April of 1968. He discovered an envelope of papers in Ray's car, the third of which Wilson was startled to find included the number of the Atlanta FBI office. Alarmed at the FBI connection and already disillusioned by the organization for which he worked, Wilson made the difficult decision to withhold the papers. He resigned from the FBI 10 years later. 2 decades after leaving the FBI, Wilson saw Coretta Scott King's appeal for a new trial for James Earl Ray, the patsy she did not believe killed her husband. Ray had claimed Raul was the mysterious gun runner who had set him up. Raul was a name Wilson had seen on another of the documents he'd found in James Earl Ray's car. Raul was later identified by James Earl Ray's defense attorney in the appeal, Dr. William Pepper, as Raul Coelho, a gun runner and drug smuggler who Ray had met in a saloon in Montreal. Pepper further claims this meeting took place shortly after Ray had escaped from prison in the U.S. following a prior conviction. In 2018, Pepper clarified what really happened in Ray's Great Escape. Quote, "He was always trying to escape when he was in prison, and we thought that that was par for the course and that he lucked out and he was able to get into this bread truck that was delivering bread to the prison and get away. And that's what I thought for all of those years. And it was only within really the last 4 or 5 years, following a deposition of a critical witness, that we learned that in fact the government had profiled James Earl Ray and they had effectively organized his escape. And I learned that because the head of the Dixie Mafia family who was working with the FBI on the killing drove to the prison, and in the car was his son, and they carried $25,000, which they gave to the warden to organize James's escape. And the son was my witness for that mission with his father. The FBI, having profiled Ray and identified him as a potential scapegoat that could be easily manipulated, bribed the warden with $25,000 delivered from Director Hoover to his right-hand man, Clyde Tolson, and taken to the prison by the Bureau's Dixie Mafia collaborator, Russell Adkins Sr. From there, it was a question of directing Ray, now an escaped convict, in a way that he could be framed for their ultimate strike against King." End quote. It's interesting to note that the alias Ray was given when he fled to Canada was Eric S. Galt. Coincidentally, there exists a real man in Scarborough, Ontario named Eric S. Galt. The real Galt worked at an arms factory in Canada, had security clearances with the US government, and had a physical resemblance to James Earl Ray. Is anyone else getting Lee Oswald, Harvey Oswald, JFK, JD Tippit, CIA smoke and mirror dirty trick vibes here? Back to former FBI agent Donald Wilson in the late 1990s. After hearing Coretta Scott King's appeal for a new trial and the mention of Raoul, Wilson decided to copy the documents he'd withheld and share them with the King family. Wilson was thereafter reluctant to speak with the press, but in 2000 he did tell his full story in an interview with James Douglas. Here's what Wilson told Douglas when asked if the assassination extended beyond the FBI. Quote, "I think it's a certainty there were outside influences and people involved in the entire process. I feel pretty strongly about that. Power brokers is a good term to use. Shadow government people who make decisions in what they feel is in the best interest of this country. They're going to have the American people read and see and hear what they think is in their best interest. People in these very high positions have a lot to lose from an economic standpoint. And this goes back to the issue with respect to King. In my opinion, King's assassination was not a white-black issue. It had nothing to do with racism. The stories you read about whether Ray was or wasn't a racist are immaterial. That's a red herring. King wanted to redistribute the wealth of this country. That was a big turnaround for him. Now that got the attention of the shadow government people. A decision was made. This man had got to be eliminated. He's simply too powerful." End quote. I suspect the real reason MLK was killed is even more sinister than military expansionism, suppression of the poor, and anti-communism. Think about the cultural context of MLK's assassination in April of 1968. The presidential election cycle of 1968 was a year of insanity. You could even say it rhymes with the election cycle of 2024. In the 2 decades following World War II, black families in America had been presented with a false dialectic for social justice. That of passive agitation masquerading as nonviolence versus militant, violent resistance by any means necessary. For decades, we failed to recognize that both movements were led by wolves in sheep's clothing, operating on behalf of a much larger, older plot. Did the Marxist cabal decide Martin Luther King Jr. would be more useful to them dead than alive, as a martyr rather than as a civil rights activist? Did they dispose of this useful idiot as they had so many before him? The 1960s kicked off with UC Berkeley students protesting outside of San Francisco City Hall because the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HCUA, had convened a series of hearings there. You know, that naughty committee working to expose ideological subversives in America. The same committee that the communists had vowed to eliminate in their goals for America. I wonder if the communists had any role in the protests and subsequent rioting. A few years later, in 1964, 1,500 students at Berkeley protested the university's resistance to their anti-war activity. More than 700 of them were arrested. FBI Director Hoover met with then CIA Director John McCone in January 1965 and began targeting subversives, including Clark Kerr, the president of UC Berkeley. McCone's next job found him working with Ronald Reagan on his California gubernatorial campaign. Reagan campaigned fervently against the New Left and vowed to end California's anti-war movement. Reagan won in a landslide the first of his 2 terms as California governor before his ascendancy to president. In August of 1967, President Johnson and FBI Director Hoover had decided to revive the illegal counterinsurgency program COINTELPRO. Johnson further decided with CIA Director Richard Helms to authorize an illegal domestic surveillance program codenamed Chaos. Thanks to these 2 secret programs and their network of well-placed informants, there was an all-out war waging in California by the summer of 1969. This war was further fueled by the heinous Tate LaBianca murders of the Manson family, now widely suspected to have been connected to Chaos. Both COINTELPRO and Chaos were used for agent provocateurs to roll out the long, slow brainwashing process of ideological subversion, ensuring they could eventually bring society collapse and instigate violent revolution by preying on racial trauma. MLK and RFK's assassinations created riots and chaos in 1968. Intelligence assets wreaked havoc at the DNC convention. Nixon nudged out a victory as the Law and Order ticket and shortly thereafter signed into law the Controlled Substances Act. Both cannabis and heroin were placed in the same most restricted category for drugs, Schedule 1. Why? Because as Nixon's chief domestic policy advisor, John Ehrlichman, said on the record, quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about drugs? Of course we did." End quote. Over the subsequent 5.5 decades, we've seen American nuclear families generally, and black families specifically, destroyed. Prison populations have grown exponentially from 300,000 in 1972 to 2.3 million today. The USA has the highest rate of incarceration, with 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. White men have a 1 in 17 lifetime likelihood of imprisonment. For black men, it's 1 in 3. 40% of the prison population today are black men. Meanwhile, the size of the government grew exponentially thanks to LBJ's Great Society programs. The federal government's liabilities exploded because of Medicare, Medicaid, and underfunded pension plans and other welfare programs. The public became increasingly dependent on handouts from Uncle Sam. The welfare state is one of the 4 horsemen of the economic apocalypse, and for the black community, the iron triangle of the black politician, the black preacher, and the black civil rights activist are its false prophets. It creates government dependency and robs the individual of his potential for self-actualization. The Aid to Families with Dependent Children program created by the Social Security Act was marketed as a financial assistance program to children whose families had low or no income. However, the act included the man-in-the-house rule, which disqualified families if there was any adult male presence in the household whatsoever. Said another way, this welfare program pays mothers more money to divorce or separate from the father rather than, God forbid, encouraging man and wife to live together and to raise children in the same household. As a result of the man-in-the-house rule, you saw the continued dissolution of nuclear families. By 2018, 23% of U.S. children lived with just one parent, more than 3 times the world average. Meanwhile, fertility rates have dropped from 3.7 lifetime births per woman in 1960 to 1.7 today. President Johnson's Great Society also included the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which for the first time provided significant federal aid to public education. The federal government co-opted local and state school systems by the strings they attached to this aid, and the influence of ideological subversion is now entrenched within our public education system. LBJ leveraged King's death to push through passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The act was billed as an extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to prohibit discrimination on the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. In August of that year, LBJ also got the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968 passed, which authorized $5.3 billion in spending over its first 3 years. The HUD Act was meant to construct or rehab 26 million housing units targeted for low and middle income families. These acts greatly increased black migration to cities, increasing the black population in urban centers 2.5x from 6.1 million in 1950 to 15.3 million in 1980. However, as History.com highlights, quote, during this same period, white Americans steadily moved out of the cities into the suburbs, taking many of the employment opportunities black people needed into communities where they were not welcome to live. This trend led to the growth in urban America of ghettos or inner city communities with high minority populations that were plagued by unemployment, crime, and other social ills. End quote. What if that had been the plan all along? Meanwhile, the cameras kept rolling, portraying black Americans as criminals and programming us for the eventuality of a race war. For a recent example of this insidious propaganda, see the film Leave the World Behind, produced by former President Barack Hussein Obama Jr. and former first spouse Michelle Obama. Black youth have been socially engineered to believe that nonviolence died when Martin Luther King Jr. was martyred, that they must therefore turn to violent leaders like those of the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam, and Black Lives Matter. This deception fails to recognize that a third option exists for initiating change, that of non-aggressive, non-cooperation with tyranny. And that brings us to the assassination of Malcolm X. But first, it's worth highlighting the commonalities and the patsies who took the blame for the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK Jr. Lee Harvey Oswald, Oswald's assassin Jack Ruby, Sirhan, and James Earl Ray. All 4 of these men showed signs of trauma-based mind control. Debaucherous tactics have been used by intelligence agencies for decades as part of MKUltra, including hypnotism, psychoactive drugs like LSD, and sexual exploitation through honeypots. The idea of a Manchurian candidate or a brainwashed assassin is not science fiction or conspiracy theory. It is a matter of historical record. John Marks detailed the CIA's efforts to develop hypnotized patsies in his book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Marks states, quote, the veteran admits that none of the arguments he uses against a conditioned assassin would apply to a programmed patsy, whom a hypnotist could walk through a series of seemingly unrelated events, a visit to a store, a conversation with a mailman, picking a fight at a political rally. The subject would remember everything that happened to him and would be amnesic only for the fact the hypnotist ordered him to do these things. There would be no gaping inconsistency in his life of the sort that can ruin an attempt by a hypnotist to create a second personality. The purpose of this exercise is to leave a circumstantial trail that will make the authorities think the patsy committed a particular crime. The weakness might well be that the amnesia would not hold up under police interrogation, but that would not matter if the police did not believe his preposterous story about being hypnotized or if he was shot resisting arrest. Hypnosis expert Milton Klein said he could create a patsy in 3 months. An assassin would take him 6. End quote. Here are a couple of historical examples. First, as I mentioned previously, did you know that RFK's patsy, Sirhan, had likely been hypnotized by Dr. William J. Bryan? Betsy Langen interviewed Bryan in 1974 when he told her he was probably the leading hypnosis expert in the world and that they had programmed people to kill all the time. He said to completely brainwash someone involved a certain amount of physical torture, long-term hypnosis, and probably drugs. Using that combination, Bryan explained, yes, you can brainwash a person to do just about anything. Bryan concluded their interview by emphatically denying he ever hypnotized Sirhan, storming out of his own office. Another fun example. Did you know that Dr. Louis Jolyon West, or Jolly West, visited Jack Ruby for psychiatric examination just before Ruby was scheduled to testify for the Warren Commission? West visited Ruby alone in his jail cell, later reporting that Ruby had an acute psychotic break. Ruby's testimony before the commission succeeded in only making him sound unhinged. He could never fully explain why he decided to kill Oswald. or to any questions that would reveal Ruby's ties to Meyer Lansky, the Mafia, anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and Oswald himself. Jolly West was a UCLA professor who just happens to have been deeply involved in the CIA's MKUltra program. If you're familiar with Christopher Nolan's film Batman Begins, the villain Scarecrow is a perfect fictionalized portrayal of Jolly West.
Yeah, Dr. Crane, I can't take it anymore. It's all too much. The walls are closing in. Blah, blah, blah. A couple of days of this food. It'll be true.
What do you want?
I want to know how you're going to convince me to keep my mouth shut.
About what? You don't know anything.
I know you don't want the cops to take a closer look at the drugs they seized. And I know about your experiments with the inmates of your nut house. See, I don't go into business with a guy without finding out his dirty secrets. Those goons you used. I own the muscle in this town. Now, I've been bringing your stuff in for months. So, whatever he's planning, it's big. And I want it.
Well, I already know what he'll say. That we should kill you.
Even he can't get me in here. Not in my town.
Would you like to see my mask? I use it in my experiments. I'm probably not very frightening to a guy like you, but these crazies, I can't stand it.
So when did the nut take over the nut house?
They scream and they cry. That's just your day now. Well, he's not faking. Not that one. I'll talk to the judge and see if I can get him moved to the secure wing at Arkham. I can't treat him here.
At the end of World War II, when the German army surrendered to the US and its allies, leaders from the OSS met with Nazi spy Reinhard Gehlen. OSS officers, including Theodore Shackley, Henry Kissinger, and Alan Dulles, developed a program to recruit Nazi intelligence agents and spies, help them to avoid persecution at the Nuremberg trials by giving them new identities, and co-opt them into American operations for the war against the Soviets. Through Operations Paperclip and Overcast, the Nazi SS and American OSS effectively merged to form the CIA at the end of World War II. The CIA inherited the Nazis' torture and mind control experiments, which the Nazis had built off the ritualistic abuse practices employed by the Holy Roman Empire. The CIA launched Operation Bluebird in 1948, which morphed into Operation Artichoke, and by April 1953, the Nazi mind control experiments became MKUltra. Dr. Jolly West enlisted in the Army Air Force during World War II, eventually rising to the rank of colonel. West worked to deprogram American prisoners of war from the Korean War, interviewing them at length and making sure they renounced their claims about having used illegal biological weapons against the Koreans. After the war, he became intimately involved in the CIA's emerging research into LSD, recruiting subjects in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury Clinic. His mind control experiments would continue during his time at University of Oklahoma and UCLA. These illegal programs were funded through CIA fronts like the nonprofit Geschickter Fund. Alan Dulles had the agency's mind control projects headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who became Jolly West's handler. Gottlieb was a poisons expert who headed the chemical division of the CIA's technical services staff. Gottlieb had the nickname of the Black Sorcerer, as he had developed gadgetry straight out of schlocky sci-fi. High-potency stink bombs, swizzle sticks laced with drugs, exploding seashells, poisoned toothpaste, poisoned handkerchiefs, poisoned cigars, poisoned anything. According to Tom O'Neill, author of Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s, quote, Project MKUltra's broadest goal was to influence human behavior. Under its umbrella were 149 sub-projects, many involving research that used unwitting participants. Having persuaded an Indianapolis pharmaceutical company to replicate the Swiss formula for LSD, the CIA had a limitless domestic supply of its favorite new drug. The agency hoped to produce couriers who would embed hidden messages in their brains to implant false memories and remove true ones in people without their awareness, to convert groups to opposing ideologies, and more. The loftiest objective was the creation of hypno-programmed assassins. The most sensitive work was conducted far from Langley, farmed out to scientists at colleges, hospitals, prisons, and military bases all over the United States and Canada. The CIA gave these scientists aliases, funneled money to them, and instructed them on how to conceal their research from prying eyes, including those of their unknowing subjects. Feeling that it was their patriotic duty, the scientists accepted their secret missions in defiance of the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. In 1949, at the Nuremberg trials that adjudicated the crimes of World War II, the United States adopted the International Code for Human Experimentation. A person must give full and informed consent before being used as a subject. MKUltra scientists flouted this code constantly, remorselessly, and in ways that stupefy the imagination. Their work encompassed everything from electronic brain stimulation to sensory deprivation to induced pain and psychosis. They sought ways to cause heart attacks, severe twitching, and intense cluster headaches. If drugs didn't do the trick, they tried to master ESP, ultrasonic vibrations, and radiation poisoning. One project tried to harness the power of magnetic fields. End quote. In December 1974, Project MKUltra came to light through a series of New York Times articles written by limited hangout specialist Seymour Hersh. First, the Church Committee and then the Rockefeller Commission investigated the program. The CIA claimed that MKUltra ended when Sidney Gottlieb retired in the early 1970s, after then-director Richard Helms ordered him to destroy all of the MKUltra files, of course. Do you think it's possible the CIA lied to the American people? Is it possible that MKUltra never ended? That, as Fiona Barnett explained, trauma-based mind control and human trafficking remains the glue that holds together the deep state's brotherhood of blackmail. Who assassinated Malcolm X? El-Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, Malcolm X, was assassinated at age 39 in the Audubon Ballroom in New York City on February 21st, 1965. 3 Nation of Islam members were incarcerated for his murder. Muhammad Abdulaziz, formerly Norman 3X Butler, Khalil Islam, formerly Thomas 15X Johnson, and Mujahid Abdul Halim, formerly Talmadge X Hayer, and Thomas Hagen. Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson were members of the Nation of Islam Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, New York. Thomas Hagen was a member of Mosque No. 25 in Newark, New Jersey. Butler and Johnson were most likely patsies who had been set up for Malcolm's assassination. While they hated Malcolm X and had taken Elijah Muhammad's side in the NOI's internal division, there is no evidence Butler or Johnson were in the ballroom that night. They would have been immediately recognized by Malcolm's security team and prevented from entering had they tried. Thomas Hagen was never meant to be arrested that day. But as synchronicity would have it, Hagen was shot in the leg by one of Malcolm's bodyguards, Reuben Francis, while fleeing the scene. A divine act of non-aggressive non-cooperation with tyranny, you could say. Hagen would later confess that he had planned the assassination with 4 other members of the Newark Mosque, and that Butler and Johnson had not been involved in the plot. Hagen's 1978 affidavit reads as follows. Quote, State of New York, County of Ulster. I, Thomas Hagen, being duly sworn, disposes and says that this affidavit is in addition to my first affidavit from 1977, and that the statements made herein are more in detail and hopefully will clear up any doubts as to what took place in the killing of Malcolm X and the innocence of Norman Butler and Thomas Johnson. It was sometime in the summer of 1964 when I was approached concerning the killing of Malcolm X. The time must have been a month or so before the Honorable Elijah Muhammad spoke in New York City in 1964. I was walking in downtown Patterson with 2 brothers, both Muslims, was driving by in their car. I knew these men well. They asked me to get in their car. They wanted to talk to me. Both of these men knew that I had great love, respect, and admiration for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. They started talking about what was going on with Malcolm X and how this man was defaming the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. This was the feelings of most men in the NOI at that time. I know that it was Ben who spoke to Leon first, and then they spoke to me. I learned from them that word was out that Malcolm X should be killed. I can't say, for I don't know who passed that word on, but I thought that Ben knew. We soon got together with 2 more men. Both lived in Newark, New Jersey. One's name was William X. I never knew his last name. The other man was a bro named Wilbur or Kinley. I don't know his full name, but we used his car on February 21st, 1965. We met a few times to discuss how to carry out this killing. Sometimes we talked while driving around, or at Ben's or Lee's house. Sometimes we drove around for hours. We tried to get as much information on the movements of Malcolm X as we could. We, the people above stated, drove out to Malcolm X's house one night to see what security was there. We found it heavily guarded. We soon decided that the only place that Malcolm X would be was at the ballroom where he was making speeches to the people there. In fact, we attended one of these meetings to see what security was there. We learned that no one was searching at the door for weapons. This was in the winter of 1964 to 65. We talked about this on the way back to Jersey. We drove back in Ben's car. We knew that the only place that Malcolm X was sure to be was at that ballroom. And we decided that with a crowd there, we could have a good chance of getting in there and out after the move was made, the shooting that is. We decided to visit the ballroom the night before the killing to set this up. It was a dance that night, and we came there like everyone else, got a ticket, went in, and looked the place over. This was February 20th, 1965. This night we used Ben's car, and on the way home we discussed what everyone thought. Everyone agreed that we would do this the next day, February 21st, 1965. The next morning we would meet at Leon's house and Ben's to go over our plans. We decided after looking at the place that we would get there early, drift in, and take sets. Leon and me up front and left side facing stage, Ben and William right behind us. I had the .45 auto, Leon the Luger, William had the shotgun. Wilbur or Kinley had the set in the back of the place. His job was to accuse someone of picking his pocket and throw the smoke bomb. This was timed to happen when Malcolm X started to greet the people. Almost at the time, William would fire the shotgun and Leon and I would fire our guns at Malcolm X and run for the door. On February 21st, 1965, we drove to New York City in Wilbur or Kinley's car, a blue Cadillac, about 1962 or so. We parked a few blocks from the ballroom on a street heading for the George Washington Bridge. We figured that with all the people there, we would make it out in the crowd. As for the weapons, I got them from a man who had them for sale. I bought them from him. This person had nothing to do with the crime. I made the smoke bomb that was used. I, Thomas Hagen, have written this affidavit in the hope that this information would exonerate Thomas Johnson and Norman Butler of the crime that they did not commit. This affidavit is factual to the best of my knowledge, and I am willing to state what took place in the matter before any court of law. Thomas Hagen, witnessed by Nuruddin Faiz, sworn to before me this 25th day of February, 1978. End quote. Historian and journalist Abdur Rahman Muhammad covered Malcolm X's assassination in the docuseries Who Killed Malcolm X? He determined that William X. Bradley was the shotgun man, Hagen's co-conspirator, who actually killed Malcolm X. We're informed by the series that William X. Bradley died before Muhammad could interview him. However, we do learn that Bradley, now Al-Mustafa Shabazz, recently appeared in a Newark mayor campaign advertisement for Cory Booker, who is now a U.S. Senator. Weird, right? Malcolm's assassination was most likely ordered by Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad told his enforcer, Boston minister Louis X, or Louis Farrakhan, that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. Farrakhan, Muhammad's son Elijah Muhammad Jr., and Joseph X, or Yusuf Shah, the captain of Mosque 7, likely orchestrated the hit. But remember what Malcolm's sister said shortly after his death? That Malcolm had felt the bombing of his home 1 week before his assassination was much bigger than the black Muslims? We now know that there were 9 FBI informants in the crowd at the Audubon Ballroom, and more from the NYPD's BOSSI, or Bureau of Special Service and Investigations Department, including Malcolm's bodyguard Gene Roberts. Why didn't they do more to prevent Malcolm's murder? Malcolm X, the week before his death, sought to make contact with the State Department to discuss threats against his life. Why the State Department? He thought the CIA was following him in Mecca. Could his assassination be related? What are we to make of the August 11th, 1964 CIA memo to Richard Helms, then Deputy Director of Plans or Covert Operations? In this memo, the agency claimed an informant told them Malcolm X and extremist groups were being funded by African states in fomenting recent riots in the U.S. The memo stated that the State Department considered the matter one of sufficient importance to discuss with President Johnson, who in turn asked Mr. J. Edgar Hoover to secure any further information which he might be able to develop. Is it just coincidence the memo's timing matches that of when Thomas Hagen says they were recruited for the murder? Is it also coincidence Hoover sent a memo with Malcolm's travel schedule to the CIA's director, the CIA's Deputy Director of Plans, the Army's Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, the Director of Naval Intelligence, the Chief of the Air Force Counterintelligence Division, and 2 foreign offices 3 weeks before Malcolm's assassination. The FBI had aggravated the dispute between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. Both were top targets of COINTELPRO, then run by Assistant FBI Director William Sullivan. When Muhammad moved from Chicago to Arizona for his health, much of his power in the Nation of Islam was delegated to John X. Ali Simmons, a former FBI agent in Chicago. Other FBI sources close to Elijah Muhammad include his son Wallace Muhammad, his grandson Hassan Sharif, and the NOI's publicist Abdul Basit Naim. If we want to know what could be bigger than the black Muslims, we can trust the old journalism cliche and follow the money. When we trace the funding of the Nation of Islam, we come across a man named H.L. Hunt. Hunt was an oil tycoon worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was also a virulent white supremacist who supported far-right extremist groups. Hunt was such a racist that he advocated deporting all African Americans to Africa. Now, if that policy sounds familiar, it's because it's the same one advocated by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, except Elijah Muhammad did so in the name of black supremacy rather than white supremacy. Different cat, same dead mouse. This was not a coincidence. H.L. Hunt provided funding to Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam throughout the life of the organization. So, it turns out that Elijah Muhammad wasn't just a creepy pedophile and serial rapist. He was also a black white supremacist. A real-life Clayton Bigsby.
There is cookie and punch for us to enjoy, and we can meet, talk about white brotherhood. Thank you all for coming. White power!
Said another way, we can think of Elijah Muhammad as the Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Janiyah Khan of the 1960s. I mentioned H.L. Hunt earlier in this essay because you'll be shocked to learn Hunt was also a CIA asset. He was also close to many of the individuals involved in JFK's assassination. So close, in fact, that according to Lyndon Johnson's mistress, Madeleine Brown, H.L. Hunt was with Vice President Johnson at the home of Clint Murchison the night before JFK's assassination. You know, the other Dallas oil tycoon who generously let the CIA S-Force train in triangular crossfire assassinations at his ranch in Oaxaca, Mexico 3 years earlier. Weird coincidence, right? In 1957, Fortune put H.L. Hunt's net worth in the $400 to $700 million range. Both Hunt and Howard Hughes were recognized as the richest man in America at various points throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Others in attendance at Murchison's home that night included FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, future Warren Commission member / head of the Council on Foreign Relations John J. McCloy, Assistant Director of the FBI Clyde Tolson, and future President Richard Nixon. That night, LBJ whispered to Madeleine Brown, "After tomorrow, those goddamn Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise." One of the men arrested and interrogated after the assassination of JFK was Eugene Hale Brading, because he had been acting suspiciously in the Dow Tex building overlooking Daley Plaza. Brading told the police he was in Dallas on oil business and had gone into the building to make a phone call. He was released without charge and returned to his room at the Cabana Motel. Brading would also be arrested for suspicious activity when coming out of the Ambassador Hotel following RFK's assassination. Weird coincidence, right? Turns out that the day before JFK's assassination, Brading and his motel roommate, Morgan Brown, had met with H.L. Hunt. It is believed that Jack Ruby was in the office at the same time as Brading. It was later established that Ruby had also visited the Cabana Motel around midnight the night of JFK's assassination. Finally, just to put a button, here's another section of James Douglas' interview of former FBI agent Donald Wilson regarding MLK Jr.'s assassination. Douglas: "Who besides you knew about the papers you had found in James Earl Ray's car?" Wilson: "I'm the only one. So it wasn't until 3 years ago when Mrs. King appeared. It was just a fluke that I saw her on television in a Tennessee courtroom making a plea for a trial for Ray. I was astounded that she would be asking for a trial for this man. I was shocked. Yet listening to her, Hearing her just struck a chord with me, and I knew this changed everything for me. If the King family wanted a trial, I had something that I thought could possibly turn the tide for them. With respect to what they were talking about, all I knew that I had were 2 documents that had the name on them of this man who Ray contended was his organizer, Raul. And I thought, what I have doesn't extricate Ray from the arena of suspicion, yet it's a degree of corroboration for his story, at least about the existence of this man. So I went about contacting the King family. I didn't even know who represented Ray. I made a lot of calls. I finally made contact with his lawyer, William Pepper, then the King's. Douglas, you could read the name Raul written on 2 papers in the envelope? Wilson, yes. One was the piece of paper torn from a telephone book. Pepper tells me he had it independently verified by an investigator as a piece of an original paper from a 1963 Dallas telephone book from the page that had the H's on it. There were several numbers there. There were telephone numbers of the Hunt Oil Company, as well as individual numbers for Hunt. That was not significant to me. Pepper was excited about that. H.L. Hunt, influential Dallas oil billionaire, had been a friend of J. Edgar Hoover since the early 1950s. Both men hated Martin Luther King. Hunt's former aide, John Currington, told Pepper that at a 1967 meeting between Hoover and Hunt, Hunt contended he could nullify King's influence by attacking him on his radio program. Hoover argued that the only way to stop King would be to completely silence him. After King's murder, Hunt told Currington that Hoover had won the argument. Also, on that same piece of paper, there was a number written at the top with the letter J circled in front of the numbers. They determined that number was for a Vegas club, which he says was Jack Ruby's club in 1963. I was absolutely astounded. End quote. What did Malcolm X learn that sealed his fate? Was it the reality of the rulers that had killed John F. Kennedy? Did he figure out who was pulling the strings for the Nation of Islam? Who was pulling the strings for Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement? Did he understand the role played by blackmail and organized crime in geopolitics? Or the nefarious operations conducted by agents within the CIA, FBI, Mossad, MI6, and KGB? Were his efforts to unite African Americans and African heads of state posing too much of a threat for the ever-expanding military-industrial complex? The scientific, technological elite? Did he figure out that all of these crime tentacles stem from the same octopus, a Marxist, Luciferian cabal? For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. This cabal, this deep state, still poses a clear and present danger to the American public, to government of, by, and for the people. If you still doubt this fact, I'll direct your attention to the attempted assassination of President Donald J. Trump on July 13th, 2024, when we return in the final episode on The Real Robert F. Kennedy.